Hello there, and welcome to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is the first installment of my. This is the first installment of my series detailing my record collection. This is going to be, like I mentioned in my record collecting philosophy video I uploaded a little while ago. This is just going to be done very off the cuff, no frills, in the manner of my Laserdisc collection videos. I'm going to go through each title, break it up into sections. I'm just going to go alphabetized because that's the way I have my shelves. So this video, I'll probably just go through the letters A through C, so that way it doesn't get too long, but I'll have enough time to go through each title, talk about mastering differences, different presses, and things like that. Just some general information in addition to just my own thoughts and why I bought certain releases or certain novelty records or things like that. So without further ado, off to the shelves. So starting out with a band identified by number, of course, which is how most record shops will start their alphabetized racks, and kind of what I loosely follow in my own collection. So this is a promotional only release that's a greatest hits compilation of the band 38 Special. Not necessarily my usual thing I'm going to go for, but it was a really cool find in store bin. So it's a super minty copy and was like 50 cents. So anytime I can find clean copies with, radio staples, as certain songs on this release are, figured why not. And again, I do believe it's a promotional only release. I don't think this was commercially put out. Of course, their standard albums are pretty commonly available, but this was just a nice piece, really great condition, really great cover. Again, you can see the promotional only stamp down here, and it's also printed on the jacket. So again, I'm pretty sure this was just a promotional only compilation, so you don't see it all the time. The other thing that made me want to pick this up is, again, the mastering is really great on this. It's credited, it has a master disc stamp. Doesn't say who specifically mastered it originally, but the albums, their main albums that a lot of these hit songs are from, do sound great already. And this pressing is really great. But also, what really made me want to pick it up is I just happened to notice that the disc itself is Quiax. And again, this is very hard to do, so bear with me, but you should be able to see that translucent brown starting to come through. Trying to do it at an angle so I don't flare out the lens, but yeah, easier said than done trying to show Quiax titles. Next up is the Flock of Seagulls self-titled debut album, and of course with the really striking sort of psychedelic and very artistic jacket, which is really cool. And again, this album is actually quite underrated. The band is underrated too. Most people know them for Iran and the Crazy Hair, which really does them a real disservice. This first album is actually really quite good and has other great notable songs, like Space Age Love Song for sure is another really great track I wish more people were aware of. This is a pretty commonly available LP. It's Arista and their Jive imprint. You can find it most places, and I actually would recommend it. Again, I think the whole album holds up pretty well. It's really solid, and I do think this band is so underrated. They should be known for more than one of the great hit singles and the Crazy Hair. And yeah, I do think this album is a great record start to finish. I would like to find the British version, the original UK pressing at some point, because apparently that's where the long version of Iran came from, which you hear sometimes on radio stations. It's the version with the really long sort of atmospheric intro that's really cool before it leads into the synth that opens the song, whereas on this pressing and almost every other US version, practically anytime you come across a song, it's just the standard version that starts with the little drum crash, little cymbal crash, and then it goes right into the song. But if you ever heard the version with the really long atmospheric intro, apparently that's on the British pressing, which I'd love to find at some point. And actually, I've looked for it before. It doesn't really pop up. So it's, one of those, unless you find it on eBay or somebody selling a copy on Discogs, you'd have to be in a British record shop. And I dream of going to the UK all the time for many reasons. One of them, of course, is to raid their record stores and buy what are common pressings over there that are definitely not common here, and then trying to get back on a plane with a bunch of record crates. So maybe I'm a very strange bird, but I think of that all the time. It's like, yeah, it'd be great to visit the UK and to visit all the sites and go to Pinewood and all the great film studios, and then load up on really common British record pressings, and probably get a lot of strange looks that I'm this crazy American buying British records. But there's a reason for it, I swear. It's because, sometimes I really want to find these pressings, but, for stuff that's super common, I'm sure a lot of people are not going to be listing it for international sales. So here's one of the later Seagulls albums, A Dream Come True, which is a fun listen, even if probably I still prefer the original self-titled more. This is a nice, cheap bin find, and you can find these pressings of the Seagulls 80s albums pretty cheaply, and they're all on the Jive label and, readily available. Next up from 1985 is a-ha's Hunting High and Low, which, again, is another one of those albums with an iconic song on it from the 80s that doesn't get talked about very much and is actually a rather solid album. I do actually like, the more and more I get into a-ha, the more I find I like. Of course, I know them for the big songs, and of course, The Living Daylights is what really got me hooked on learning more about them. This is actually quite a good record. Sounds really great. I did always wonder what a UK pressing might sound like, or a European pressing, because of course, European band, usually the European version is slightly better. But the mastering is credited as being done at K-Disc in Hollywood, which would indicate that, the US pressing would be the one to go with. It's on the Warner label, so it's nothing fancy. Really nice sound, though, I have to admit. So I actually would recommend this if you're a fan of the band. Doesn't pop up all the time, and of course when it does, people now know it as the Take On Me album. So with the whole vinyl revival that's made anything with some notoriety on the internet, have a certain monetary value to it. So yeah, you don't see this all too often. Usually it's pretty beat up, but I couldn't pass up a super minty copy. The vinyl on this is just absolutely pristine, and this is one of those albums with all the synth usage and everything. You don't want to listen to Take On Me with a wall of crackle and noise. It's the original inner, which has a pretty cool negative image on the back. There is a SR signed in the dead wax on this release, so I'm not for certain. It could be that this was mastered by Stan Ricker, but you can't necessarily take just the dead wax initials alone unless you have some sort of notion that this was, actually mastered by somebody. The credit says Bobby Cata at K-Disc Mastering in Hollywood, LA. The actual dead wax has an SR in it, so it is possible this is a Stan Ricker cut. Stan Ricker being one of the great engineers of the final era. But again, it sounds really great. So I don't think a UK original would be much better than this release. Next up is a-ha's Stay on These Roads, their album from 1988. You don't see this one as much, and of course 1988 is getting into the CD era where vinyl sales and production were really starting to taper off. This is in super minty shape, and I picked it up primarily for three reasons. One, it was cheap. Two, it's a promotional copy, which has the stamp here on the front corner with the typical gold lettering, which usually they wouldn't put it on the front. It would be on the back, but every once in a while you see this style of promo stamp on the front. And of course, anytime I can find a promo copy, I try and get it, because that almost always indicates early stamper or first stamper went to a radio station or a DJ or a music critic, so it would have been right off the presses, right from the master when it was brand new, and played well on good equipment a few times, and then properly, hopefully, stored. So usually a promo pressing is a good indication that you have an early or first stamper, and it should be in really premium shape. Otherwise, it's the same as a standard pressing, and most of the time you see two copies in the bin. One is a promo, one is not. I usually will go for the promo if it's the same price or less, simply because it's usually an early stamper, usually in better shape, and I really like having that promo sticker. It makes me feel like I've achieved something special, when of course I really haven't. Some people will charge premium prices for promo copies. Again, it's usually the exact same thing, and unless you sit there and compare the dead wax and see that it is indeed an earlier stamper, it's just the cachet of having a promo copy. So again, that's just something extra, an extra incentive for me a lot of times. The other reason why I picked this up is this actually has the band's version of The Living Daylights, which, of course, is the title track they made for the 1987 masterpiece James Bond film. Show you the rear. Of course, this is their version of the song and not the film version that was, pretty much finished by John Barry. He and the band didn't really see eye to eye and kind of butted heads, so there are two competing versions of the song. So the band's version is on this album, and I think some later compilations as well. It's not as good as the film version, but, I always wanted to have a copy of the alternate, so this was a good way to do it by getting the album it's included in. The rear jacket's a little blank, but I guess that's the sort of notion they were going for on the white background. But again, you can kind of tell this was designed with CD in mind in terms of dimensions, which by 1988 is very common on album jackets because, again, 1988 is already firmly in the CD era. Here is the inner, which looks pretty nice. There are no mastering credits on here anywhere on the jacket, the LP, anything, so I'm not exactly sure who mastered this. To get a pretty cool custom label. And of course, both sides credited on side B label. Now we move on to AC/DC, and this is one of a number. I got really lucky a couple years ago. Somebody traded in their collection at the local record shop, so I was able to walk in one day, and there were a number of really great shape early U.S. pressings of most of the Bon Scott era albums, a good number of them. So that's had me pretty set on the Bon Scott era for the most part, because what would be the best thing to do is to go down and go down literally and go down to Australia and track down original pressings. But just the original Australian Albert pressings are pretty much the most prized versions among fans and collectors of AC/DC, generally viewed as the best versions to have, and they have all the original track listings because, unfortunately, as most import albums were, done in the 60s and 70s, the early AC/DC era albums were always cut up in their track listings and sometimes had different covers and stuff. So pretty much there are some variations, and all the way through. Of course, Highway to Hell and Back in Black are fine and standardized across the world, but all the early Bon Scott era albums exist in different track listings across the world. The Albert releases generally are viewed as the best ones, supposed to come from master tape, so on and so forth, but they're very expensive, very rare, very highly collectible, and these source recordings are not, technically the greatest in the world, so they are pretty raw in places. And, if you got one of those Albert releases and you paid a couple $100 for it, you might be a bit taken aback at how, rough they sound because that's how the recordings are. But there are some pressings to seek out, US and UK pressings, so you can not have to pay the expense or, maybe wait and save to get some of the original Albert pressings, because again, they will cost you an arm and a leg. One of those is this one. This is the U.S. Atco pressing of Let There Be Rock, 1977. What's really cool about this is the UK and US pressings use apparently the same master. This is mastered by George Peckham, the legendary George Peckham. It's signed with his usual Porky prime cut signature. He did the UK version, and apparently that got reused over here, so you can get the same mastering. Some people say the UK version sounds a bit better, primarily most likely because of cleaner vinyl, like a lot of UK presses are, simply better because it's a cleaner vinyl on most British pressings compared to American ones. But this one's no slouch, and what's really cool is the sound of this and its UK brother. It's got nice energy to it. The mastering's great. The only problem is some of the tracks are changed around because it was, censored with, and so certain songs were removed and then replaced with some older tracks. But a lot of people are used to the U.S. or foreign track listing version of Let There Be Rock. So that's kind of commonplace with most AC/DC records, that people got used to the foreign versions instead of the original Australian versions. This copy's in really nice shape for the jacket and the age. Again, usually you find AC/DC stuff, particularly earlier pressings from the 70s, original US pressings, they're going to have some wear and tear. They're going to be pretty beat up, and they're going to be a bit on the pricier side because they don't pop up all the time, and it's AC/DC. So I was really happy to get, most of the run there, and, in one fell swoop for, $3 to $6 a pop, which was really great because, ever since then, I've just seen prices go higher and higher. So again, this has this really great Porky mastering, George Packham mastering, and I really do highly recommend this one. Again, if you can get the UK version, it's supposed to be slightly better. It's supposed to have the same mastering. So it has the original yellow Atco label, which of course dates back to the late 60s, early 70s. And as you can tell, it ends in the letters SP, which indicate this is a specialty plant pressing. So again, if you look at copies of this, you'll want to look in the dead wax to see if it indeed says a Porky Prime cut. That's what you're going to want to look for. Of course, the sound of the source recording is going to have some baked in, trying to think of the right word. It's not low quality, but it has that raw sound of the earlier AC/DC albums. But this mastering is really great. So I love the way this thing sounds. So you will not be disappointed. Next up, of course, is Powerage from 1978 with the very iconic cover artwork. Again, really cool that the jacket was in nice shape. Of course, this has transitioned over to Atlantic. It's not quite glossy on the jacket, but it has like a slight tinge of glossiness, which is cool that's retained its luster. Again, you find copies of this, and the jacket's usually pretty beat, and of course, because it's Powerage, you usually are going to pay a premium. Like with any album, audiophiles in the vinyl community have different favorite pressings. This is the U.S. pressing. There's the U.K. pressing, which is very revered. I think there's also a German one a lot of people like. This one sounds exceptional. What's cool about this? Here's the Atlantic label, and if you look at the catalog number information right here, you see it ends in the letters MO, which indicates this is a Monarch pressing from the Monarch plant in Los Angeles. A lot of people are now becoming more aware of the Monarch plant. They did, a lot of cuttings, and the idea is that they did things right from tapes, literally, because they were in LA, and so they would just literally drive the tapes over. Again, the notion of different printing plants having different sonic signatures and certain ones being more preferable over others, it really depends on the label or the particular album. Some albums it really matters, like the Doors' first couple albums, and then which is really, I think, where the notion of Monarch being like the best plant to go for came from, because it seemed they got better tape sources for the first three Doors albums in particular. But the notion of the Monarch version being the one to really go for, it doesn't apply to every single album. And your results may vary, but it is cool when you find one, because they're definitely not as common when you're like me, much more towards the East Coast. So if I ever get one, I always kind of do a happy dance, because it's like, cool, I got a Monarch, man. So this is a Monarch press copy, and this is actually mastered by the great George Piros. It has his usual Atlantic GP, meaning George Piros signature, and he did most of the really great Atlantic cuts in the 1970s. So if you see GP on an album in the dead wax, you know you're in for a treat. Sound on this is really great. I love the way this sounds. Again, some people do like the British version, of course, if you have a UK original pressing, and again, the German one as well. But this will definitely do well for you if you're just looking for a great version of Powerage to have. Next is the classic live album, If You Want Blood. You've got it. Of course, that's implied. Jacket's in really nice shape. Usually you find this, like the others, it's kind of beat up a bit. And again, really glad I got all these in one fell swoop. Here's the rear. And again, on the Atlantic label, this is a specialty pressing, and again, mastered by George Piros. It sounds wonderful. Again, certain engineers, certain mastering engineers, if you see their initials or their name anywhere on it, you know you're in for a treat. And of course, George Piros is one of the legendary elite engineers. Of course, have to have a copy of Highway to Hell, which is getting quite difficult to find original copies in decent shape that's not marked up to some ridiculous degree. Of course, as with the entire AC/DC catalog, there's many, many reissues, but I don't think anything's really quite got the mojo of the original pressings. some people love the UK first pressing, some people love the US first pressing. There is a little bit of mixed difference in terms of if you were lucky enough to have both. I believe what it is that the US version is supposed to have a bit of a warmer feel and a bit more clarity in the vocal, whereas the UK version has a bit more clarity in all of the instruments. Again, that's just something I've read on some of the forums and stuff, and I've heard some samples people have posted, so I do think there is something to that. But this does sound wonderful. Again, it's got Mutt Lange production for the first time with the band, so anything he produced usually has a very, very wonderfully produced, very clean sound to it. So this is definitely, a lightning leap forward for the band in terms of recording techniques and, better sound quality. Of course, iconic album, iconic jacket. Always happy to find iconic albums with the jacket, not destroyed and not, $20+. Rear's got a little damage, but it's not terrible, and I was just happy to finally find a good condition copy of this that they didn't charge me an arm and a leg for. Again, on the Atlantic label, it's a specialty pressing and mastered by George Piros. So if you're looking for a great Highway to Hell and you find a nice, clean, original US copy like this, I think you're pretty set unless you're a diehard and you want to track down that UK pressing to have both on hand. Of course, you have to have Back in Black, and even if you're not a fan of AC/DC, you need this particular record. This, while I do prefer the earlier albums, there's no getting around this being such a huge, iconic album and being one of the, 5 or so greatest selling albums of all time. And of course, you've heard practically all the songs before because they've been used on in licensing, and they're still played to this day as, radio hits and so on and so forth. But this particular pressing is so good. It's one of those that it's like you're hearing these songs for the first time. This, for me, is top tier in terms of best vinyl releases of all time, best mastering I've ever encountered. This was mastered by the legendary Bob Ludwig, or Robert Ludwig, who signed most of his releases with his RL signature, and that's what you want to look for this. So this is the original iconic embossed cover. It's a little dinged up, but I was primarily looking at the vinyl itself and the dead wax, because the key is to find a original issue that has his RL signature and the dead wax on both sides, which means both sides contain his mastering. And again, the mastering on this is just sublime. If you're not an AC/DC fan, you still need this. It is that good. You may think you've heard Back in Black 5 million times. You've heard Hell's Bells 5 million times, licensed and everything. And then when you hear it on this, you're hearing it for the first time. The mastering is that astonishing. Again, this is in my top 10 best-sounding records that I own, I've ever encountered. It's that good, but you have to track down a version that has his signature on both sides of the dead wax. It's the standard US Atlantic pressing. You may have to go through a couple copies. You got to make sure you don't buy a Record Club copy, or I've seen some that just have his signature on one side. But again, the key is finding it on both sides. Now, he didn't always sign both sides of certain releases, so if you have one that's got his signature on one side, chances are the second side, if there's no other signature or indication, chances are it's his mastering on the second side as well. But the only way to definitively know for sure that you've got it on both sides and you have an early original copy is to get one with his signature on both sides. And sometimes that can be very difficult. I know on certain titles it took me ages, but I really wanted to get a very first issue of The Police's Synchronicity with his brilliant mastering, which again is like this album, top tier, beautiful. So it took me a long while, but I was finally able to get one from a seller that I could verify it was an RL on both sides, because every one I found, it was just one-sided. Again, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not on both sides, but just the only way to know for sure is to have it on both sides. Of course, I have the very striking but simplistic inner with the band shots. And then I've always loved the silver Atlantic label, which is what the original pressing is on. This is a specialty pressing, and it does have the Master Disc RL in the dead wax on both sides. And of course, this was by the time he was working at Master Disc, and so it would usually carry the Master Disc stamp and then have his RL written in. And trust me, there is little more magical in the realm of music collecting or record collecting than the RL signature. So those two letters mean you are in for a sonic sublime treat. So again, you need this record if you don't have it. You need this record ultimately. If you have a turntable, you need this record. This is one of those like 10 or 15, like the starter kit that you need. It's an astonishing release. Nothing has ever come close. I think the only other good version I've ever heard is the original CD, the Barry Diamond mastered one, which you have to track down. Outside of that, every time they remaster it, it's just ruined. And I'm not even a giant AC/DC fan, and this just totally blew me away. Again, when I do like a top best sounding vinyl releases that I own, or just in my opinion, I'm planning on doing one of those. This will be in there. This is like top 5 easily, if not top 10. There are a lot of really great sounding releases out there, but this is just so important. And it's like the everything came together. Brilliant production. Mutt Lange again. It sounds even better than Highway to Hell, and brilliant, staggeringly amazing mastering. Again, all-time great mastering, I think. So you need this record in your collection 100%, but just make sure it's a double-sided RL. So the magic returns with AC/DC's follow-up to Back in Black, For Those About to Rock. Of course, the cover has all the similarities. It's also got the embossed logo and cannon, and it's got... Of course, it's not black or white, but I've always felt this sort of copper bronze color was supposed to match Back in Black. Fortunately, this jacket's got a little bit of wear and tear, but again, the vinyl itself is what I was going for. And again, for trying to find a lot of these albums, especially the more iconic, more popular titles, it's getting more difficult to find affordable copies. So sometimes I live with a little wear and tear if it's a nice, affordable copy. This one, unfortunately, the songs are not quite up to the standard of Back in Black. So I think it's safe to say it's been always felt a disappointment coming off of Back in Black. And I don't listen to it all that often. This is kind of about the point where I check out, but I have a couple of the later albums simply because they're getting harder to find and the mastering is exceptional. So Mutt Lange returns. The sound of this album is phenomenal. I highly recommend it, even if you're not a fan, if you find a cheap copy, because it just sounds incredible. And you do get this lovely gatefold with a nice band shot. So here's the rear jacket. I thought it was really cool that they went with this sort of copper-colored Atlantic label, which I guess is supposed to match the cover. Again, this is a double master disc RL copy. This is what you want to find. This thing sounds incredible, almost as good as Back in Black sounds. I mean, it sounds phenomenal, but again, the songs really are not up to the same level as Back in Black all the way through. So, of course, pretty much everybody knows the title track, which is really... It sounds so good it's worth the cost of admission if you find a nice affordable copy of this. Because it's not as iconic as Back in Black, it's usually nowhere near as expensive. But again, with the vinyl revival making prices soar, it's kind of gotten harder to find anything at a decent price. But I will say this is one of those really great budget-friendly titles that can be a real system demo. It sounds incredibly amazing. Again, almost at the level of Back in Black. And technically, in some ways, because the production is a bit better technically, I do think it's better in some ways. It's great to have as a companion piece, and a lot easier to find a double RL for this for a cheap price than it is for Back in Black. So highly recommended, if only as a demo, system demo LP. Next up is AC/DC's Fly on the Wall from 1985. After a certain point, I always kind of check out with Back in Black, and I've picked up a few of the later albums, this one in particular, simply because it was a really nice copy and rather cheap, and it's still got the great Bob Ludwig mastering. So this is one I simply bought because it's an RL cut. I will admit there are many times I've bought releases simply because it's affordable, looks cool, or it has a really great engineer mastering. So yeah, that's when you know you have it bad, because you're buying records simply because it's got Bob Ludwig's name on it, or George Piro's, or Wally Troggett, or Stan Ricker, all these guys. So yeah, that's really the reason why I bought this. And it does sound great. I just don't listen to it nearly as much as the others, simply because I'm if I had to choose, I'm much more into the earlier Bon Scott era albums, and Back in Black is really the line in the sand for me. But there are some good tracks in the later albums, and I do need to dig more into their later catalog. Do get a custom band logo on the inner this time with song lyrics. Most of the AC/DC albums I have just have generic inners, so I'm only going to show inners when they've actually, it's an actual custom inner. Otherwise, I'd just be showing generic paper sleeves till the end of time. On the Atlantic label, this time colored a bit brown, and again, this is a double master disc RL, which is primarily why I picked it up. It's also a specialty pressing for those concerned. Next up, last for AC/DC is the compilation record, I guess you would call it, of 74 Jailbreak. This came out, I believe, in 1984, and basically it's got this lovely sleeve, but it's basically a compilation of songs that were on the original Albert Australian versions of their earlier albums, just not released over here. So it's not technically a full album. I don't think you'd consider it an EP either. It basically kind of gets slotted in their discography. Of course, with all the various reissues, compilations, and then remasters and such, these songs have been released elsewhere, but this was, for those in the States, the first great way to get a lot of these songs in one nice place and really good quality. Also, of course, you see it's got the promotional stamp, and it was a great condition and a nice price, so of course I was going to get it. And it does have Jailbreak, which is probably quite possibly, if I had to choose a favorite, it's probably my favorite AC/DC song. And what really made me excited is it's Jailbreak with an RL mastering. So this is an RL LP, just like the other 80s era AC/DC albums. Sounds phenomenal. And if you find it, because it's not a full album, usually doesn't go for a lot. But again, with everything, it's gotten more expensive. I really love the image they chose for the inner. It's really nice. And of course, everything looks more dramatic in black and white. The reverse is just a plain lyric sheet on red to match the rear jacket. Standard Atlantic label. This is a specialty pressing again, and it is signed Masterdisc RL on both sides, which is the sign of greatness you always want to look for. So don't pass these up if you come across it. Again, sounded really great, and it was really cool to have probably my favorite AC/DC song ever with RL mastering. Next up is Accept's Balls to the Wall album. I'm not really a metal person, but there are a couple songs I've always liked, and I've loved the title track to this album ever since I first heard it as a kid. They used to run it on, I think it was VH1. They would always put it in the pop-up video segments or whenever they would run vintage stuff, and then we'd hear it on the radio every once in a while. So there was the slight novelty aspect because the title is just kind of cheesy and goofy in that weird way. But I've loved it ever since I first heard it. So I was always like, if I could ever find this album in good shape, I wanted to get it just for the title track. But the rest of the album's actually quite good, and the sound is really exceptional. But again, I'm not really a metal person, so this is pretty much as far as I go into metal in terms of what I've got in my collection. And anything metal getting on up into the more notable bands is, of course, going to skyrocket in value. So there's a number of different masterings for this, but this is actually a early U.S. pressing. It's CBS. It's on the Portrait label. But what's really cool, I was not aware there was an RL version floating around out there until I stumbled across this. So, of course, I grabbed it immediately. Of course, German band, so a lot of people like the German vinyl. There's also the first British pressing, but I don't think anything's going to top this RL mastering, which sounds great. But like I said, there's a number of masterings floating around, so you'll have to look at what's on your copy, because I think there's another mastering for the US pressings as well. Here's the rear. And don't forget, it's also on cassette. An interesting looking band shot. And here's the lyric sheet with, of course, another shot of the literal balls in the hand. And it's on the Portrait label, and I don't have too many Portrait records, so it's kind of strange having this Accept album on the same label as, Cyndi Lauper records. Just kind of a little bit strange. Of course, it does have the Masterdisc stamp with the RL signature here on side 1, but side 2 just has a Masterdisc stamp. So, again, he didn't always sign both sides. Again, that goes for pretty much everybody, all the great engineers. So if you're looking for their particular cuttings, as long as it's on one side, that usually means you're good. But there are certain instances where you know of, or people talk about having a double-sided copy, which again makes you feel better. But 9 times out of 10, as long as you have it on one side and the other side has the Masterdisc stamp, you're pretty good. You pretty much in safe territory that he cut both sides, and both sides do sound great. This sounds phenomenal. So if you do stumble across this, or you really love the title track like I do, definitely grab it while you can, because the RL version doesn't pop up all the time. Next up is Bryan Adams' Cuts Like a Knife from 1983. Really lovely cover image, looks great on the LP dimensions, and it's actually a pretty common album. You can get most of Bryan Adams' big 2 or 3 or 4 80s albums for relatively cheap, and they all sound excellent. A couple of them, like this one, were actually cut by Bob Ludwig, so you can find it with his RL signature, and again, sounds great. So it's a really nice RL cut you can get for $2-3 in most good record shops. Of course, with the vinyl revival, prices have skyrocketed for everything, but this is a pretty common title, nice solid 80s album that shouldn't cost you a whole lot and has really great, nice mastering on it. Of course, you have to actually look at the dead wax, because not every copy out there will have the same mastering, and so I did kind of hunt around for a while till I found an RL of this, and I still need to get the other one that he cut, which I believe is the If You Want It album, which is the other main Bryan Adams album of the 80s. It's those 4, these 2, and then Reckless, and then Into the Fire. So we're here on the A&M label with the black label. This is signed RL with the Masterdisc stamp. He signed it on both sides, so it is a double-sided RL cut. Again, you can get this for very, very cheap. It's a very common title. Just make sure you get a nice clean copy with the signature on both sides if you really want to do your due diligence. What's also cool about this release, it's QIX time. I should explain about QIX for those who didn't see my introduction video. QIX was a different vinyl formulation they came up with sometime in the late 70s, early 80s, and it was supposed to be a more premium formulation with quieter vinyl surfaces, so it was supposed to be just better overall. And some, like Warner Brothers, used it as a marketing thing, and they would actually make their promos QIX and put a big sticker on it, but it's still the same pressing, same mastering as the standard copies. But it seems a lot of other plants just kind of used it for certain labels and just didn't say anything about it. So sometimes you just stumble across releases and you just happen to catch it in the light, and you see the trademark translucent quality of the light going through, and you see a color. Usually it's a translucent brown. Sometimes they would color it, so you sometimes get it purple or green. Sometimes, very rarely, you get like a red or a blue, but it has been known to happen. That's usually the sign that you have a secret QIX pressing, which is pretty much in the 80s period. But like I said, only Warner Brothers would really credit things as being QIX with their promos, with the big black sticker saying, QIX 2 or whatever. Later on, they came up with newer, better formulations of QIX. Classic records in the 90s and 2000s would use that, and they'd say it's like QIX 4 type vinyl, 200 gram pressing, so on and so forth. So if you've ever heard the name before, that's where it comes from. It's not anything different than what you're getting on a standard pressing. It's just really cool that you have these secret QIX titles. And, it does seem to make a difference, I've noticed. Every title that I've found that I have that's QIX, usually has really nice playing surfaces, even if they're not in the best shape. So I do think there is something to it, and I really like the whole treasure hunt notion of you just find these secret titles. There were other formulations that weren't QIX that sort of did the same thing, and they would market them under different titles. The big one that comes to mind is the Police's Synchronicity was put out on KC 600 audiophile vinyl. If you held it to the light, it's purple. So that's why if you want to check your copies, you want to see if you have a KC600 purple, audiophile vinyl version. But basically, it was just a different version of what Quiex did. But this is one of those I just happen to note is one of these secret stealth Quiex discs. So again, if you find one of these for $3, you get double RL, great mastering, really great 80s album, and you can hopefully find a Quiex pressing. So you get all three, and it's a really great experience. Next up, of course, is Reckless. I don't think it's any secret that this is Bryan Adams' biggest album, viewed as generally his best album, has, most of his really big hit singles of the 80s all on the same album. So usually doesn't turn up as much, usually more on the beat up side. Usually you have to pay a bit more of a premium for it because it's the one most people are going to be familiar with. Of course, one of the great, nice, iconic covers of the 80s. It's got a nice slight glossiness on the jacket. And I'll tell you, I went through an untold amount of these in the bins trying to find a nice copy, but I was always looking for a particular cutting because I read somewhere on the internet or a forum or something that there was an RL version. So I searched every copy I came across. There's a handful of albums I always search for cuttings, and I could never find one, never could find one in good shape. And then, I've heard rumors that maybe the RL was in Canada. So I'm like, now I need to find a Canadian version, which, surprisingly, which doesn't really pop up. So, it's like, I really want to get a copy of this because I love the sound of this album, which is really well recorded. Here's the rear. Jacket's in really great shape. I was so happy I waited because this copy is practically immaculate. Here's the lyric sheet. So this is produced by Bob Clearmountain. Anything with his name in the credits list usually will sound really great to begin with. And it is credited as being mastered by Bob Ludwig. So I guess maybe that's where that started. But I've never found a vinyl version with his signature in the dead wax. So I'm guessing it maybe is out there somewhere. Again, I don't know if it is that Canadian issue I read about somewhere, but I've just never found one. So I finally gave up and bought one. And another thing to look for is the early copies will all have the custom Reckless label. Later copies will just have the plain white A&M label. It's not necessarily a first issue, but certain plants I've seen would just print the standard white A&M label no matter what, but still have the early stampers. So it also depends on what plant was printing these, but you'll want to try and find one of these with the custom label. The mastering is by Bill Kipper at Masterdisc, who was a really great engineer. The sound on this is really incredible. I just think that if there is an RL version, it might sound a little bit better. Bill Kipper cut the ZZ Top album DeGello, which is a really great sounding album, but if you're very, very, very picky and you take a lot of time trying to find it, there is a RL version of that album, which is very rare and took me a number of years to find and does actually sound better than the Bill Kipper version. So I'm wondering if there's a similar scenario with Reckless here. But again, I've just never seen anybody actually have an RL, let alone find one. And this does sound really great. So, it would take a lot to improve over this. And of course, what's cool about this is it's another secret Quiex release. And as you can see, this one has that slight. It's a green. It's a very slight. It's not like a super vibrant green, but instead of being the translucent slight brown, it's a slight green. There are some Quiex titles out there that are like full blown green, purple, red, blue, but usually it's this very translucent quality. I also want to point out this was still in there. This is the original promo for the Bryan Adams Reckless video tie-in. So you could mail this away and get a discount on the VHS Hi-Fi or Beta Hi-Fi tape that ran approximately 30 minutes. So, of course it has a tagline, "The video that strikes while the album's hot." And of course, with any mail-in, you have to wonder if you dropped it in the mail now and what would happen, if anything. But very cool this is still in there. Hasn't been dinged up or anything. And, when I got it home and slid the record out, this just came out. I didn't even realize it was in there. So it's always cool when original promo pieces are still intact. And here is Bryan Adams' Into the Fire. So like I mentioned earlier, it's pretty much these main 4 albums of the 80s that are, his most primary, not necessarily desirable, but the main 4 or so albums that most people are going to be most interested in and really represent his entire 80s sound. Because after this, you get to stuff like Waking Up the Neighbors in the 90s, where he changed up his sound and went in a different direction that's different from what he was famous for in the 80s. And most amazingly, I picked this up a number of years ago, still in the shrink with the hype sticker, and it was literally $1. So I sometimes keep the price stickers on if it's on the shrink, just to remind me where I got it. I always like being able to think back about that. And, you can find great copies for $1. It does happen. Of course, this was released into the CD era, so you can pick it up on CD for pretty cheap. Sound disc is quite good. It also, again, produced by Bob Clearmountain, and it does credit Bob Ludwig for the mastering. Nice custom inner. And then the lyric sheet. Nice custom labels with the album title. And again, it's credited to Bob Ludwig, but it just has master disc handwritten in on the dead wax. So I do believe that it means it is his mastering because no one else is credited and no one else signed it. But it's just one of those where you just kind of have to guess. But all the evidence would point it to being another Bob Ludwig mastering, and it sounds really great. So I would agree with that idea. And of course, Return of the Quayax. Next is a copy of the Allman Brothers Band's album Idlewild South on the Atco label. All the early Allman Brothers stuff is really incredible, and I would love to get more original pressings, but finding them in good, clean shape at affordable prices, not necessarily the easiest thing to do. This one was a bin find. It's a bit beat up and everything, but I bought it because condition was actually pretty good, and it's got the preferred mastering of this album. So unfortunately, it has the original owner initials in here, and also on the label, which is the standard yellow Atco. So in the dim wax, it has the AT designation, meaning Atlantic, and but what's also got, it's got a handwritten what looks like an AB in lowercase, and that's what a lot of people on forums and such suggest are really great or the best sounding cuts of these particular albums. So I was going to get this anyway, but I just got home and looked it up and saw that. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's what that means. Somebody knows something about those letters I was wondering about. So this does sound really good, but of course, condition isn't the greatest, so it does have, a lot of crackle and noise built into it. But the music and mastering does overpower it a lot, so I would recommend it even if you find one that looks a little dinged up. These older pressings, the vinyl's a little heavier. It's definitely a lot sturdier than what you'd think. So you might be surprised very pleasantly that what may not look like the best playing surfaces actually, holds up pretty well through all this time. Here is the immortal classic album, Live at Fillmore East. If you don't know this album, check it out. It is an astonishing work, and you're not even getting the whole concert, and it's still staggering. There are later releases and reissues where you can get, more of, or if not the entire concert, but even what's on here on this double LP set, it's iconic. The cover's iconic. It's just a staggering achievement. Easily one of the handful of truly great live albums ever. Personally, I would rank this behind only The Who's Live at Leeds, which I think is the greatest live album ever. But this is right there. And what blew me away most, and was still my favorite part, is the absolutely epic rendition of the classic song "Whipping Post," which on this runs, a solid 23 minutes. It's absolutely staggering. So if you do want to get this album, the best sounding version is this original Capricorn Records release. Very lucky to find a nice original copy with the cover in good shape. It is a gatefold, of course. A nice band shot. It's got a textured inner, so that's interesting. And here's the rear. What you want to look for, of course, is the original Capricorn pressing. It says Capricorn on the jacket. Primarily, these are known by the labels, which you can see here. are pink and on the Capricorn label. So these are known as the pink Capricorn version or the pink Capricorn label because that's what the label is. So you will want to find a copy with these pink Capricorn labels. And these were mastered by George Piros. They sound absolutely stunning. So you'll want to find one with his initials on there. So we need to look for his initials and the pink Capricorn labels. Apparently, the original owner decided to write the words "fast, fast" across the jacket and all the labels. So that's the only real problem I have with this copy. But that's something I can overlook very easily. The sound on this is incredible. The performances are incredible. This is one of those iconic records that everybody needs to hear at least once in their lives. It's an astonishing live album and doesn't really sound better than this release. So look for these original pink Capricorn labels. They are getting harder to find. Usually they're going to be really beat up. I was shocked to find this in great shape. I was always looking for a copy online that I could afford that was in good condition, and they're not super expensive, but people who have these know what they have, and they don't really want to sell them because it's that good. So yes, absolutely essential vinyl ownership title right here. Just look for the original pink Capricorn label. Next up is Gregg Allman's solo album, Laid Back, which I really picked up because I always loved the re-recorded version of Midnight Rider that he did, and I know some people totally disagree with this, but for me, I much prefer this version of Midnight Rider to the original Allman Brothers version, which is also great, but if I had to choose, I prefer the re-recorded version. It's a pretty common LP. It's on the Capricorn label. Has this nice gatefold with some band shots and everything. So here's the Capricorn label, the more modernized version, so it's not the pink one. The jacket credits Sterling mastering by George Marino, another one of the great engineers. There's no signature on here, so I would assume that he did cut this as well. But whenever there's no indication or no signature, it's kind of hard to tell for sure. But I would believe he did because it does sound great. So. If you like this version of Midnight Rider, definitely pick this up. It's a pretty common title you can get for rather cheap, under $5. Pretty solid album for the rest of it, but I primarily picked it up for that because I do love this version. So I have a lot of personal history with this next one. This is, of course, the Best of the Animals compilation from MGM Records, released here back in the 60s for the U.S. market, since MGM handled all of the U.S. Animals albums. This has a lot of resonance with me. It was one of the first used records I ever bought. Of course, this is a much nicer upgrade copy, but I was lucky enough that I did pick up the original mono version. There is a stereoized version of this, which is nowhere near as good. You need to stick with the original mono for the mono recordings. What makes this such a great compilation album is, it's pretty much all the big songs and covers and hit singles that the Animals had at the time. It's pretty much the bulk of their iconic tracks, and you can get them presented in mono, and the versions on here, the mastering is really great. The trick is, of course, finding a clean original copy. I have heard from some that if you find original copies, the vinyl's a little heavier, and you have to find very early copies with the sort of glossy finish on the black MGM label. But this one is the cleanest one I've ever come across. And the jacket's actually in nice shape, has some of its original glossiness still present. I've always loved this cover. To me, it's rather iconic. And the Animals are one of those bands where they were primarily a singles band in their native UK market. Then the albums will be compiled from the singles with some other songs thrown in. And in the grand scheme of things, it would be best to get those original 1960s UK albums and singles, but that is a very expensive and difficult commodity because, of course, you're talking about British vinyl from the 60s, and that's not going to be very common. And if you do find examples of those, they're not going to be in very good shape for sure. I did finally manage to get at least one of the UK Animals 7-inch singles, and it's definitely on the noisier side. It was advertised and misgraded, but I did finally manage to get one, and sounds great through the crackle, but getting a clean original US mono pressing of the best of is really the easiest and most recommended way of starting your Animals collection. The Animals are an exceptionally difficult band to collect for, what with how their US albums were just totally cut and paste jobs where they would make entirely new albums for the US market. I'm talking about MGM, which we'll get to on the next record. But this is the great starting point. And again, if you get a really good condition mono copy, you've got some of their great singles, some of the greatest songs of all time in really great condition, really great mastering. What's also great about this release, you get the full-length version of House of the Rising Sun instead of the single edit that's on the MGM US LP of the Animals that advertises. It has the hit single House of the Rising Sun, but unfortunately it's the terrible single edit. So the best of gets you the full-length version, as it should always be heard, and equally as great, if not even slightly more important, you get the alternate vocal U.S. single mix of We Gotta Get Out of This Place, which has a completely different Eric Burdon vocal, which totally wipes the floor with the U.K. version, which you hear much more often. Well, I should say, whenever it gets licensed, you never know which version they're going to use, but once you hear the U.S. version that's on the this LP, this best of, it's on the U.S. 7-inch 45, I mean, it is a blistering vocal. I think it's the definitive version of that song, which, of course, is, again, one of the greatest songs of all time. So another great reason why this LP is so important. They've reissued this a couple times over the years. Just recently, a couple years ago, they did a clear vinyl version with this cover, but I don't know the lineage. I'm sure it was probably Digital Source or something, and I don't know if it uses the U.S. version of We Gotta Get Out of This Place, but I do think this is a very important record for a lot of reasons. It's a great starting off point. If you're interested in the Animals and you don't have any of their releases on vinyl, this is the starting off point. But again, you got to make sure you track down a really nice condition copy and make sure you get the mono version. The stereo one, everything's identical. Catalog number's a little different, and it will have on the bottom here, sounds great in stereo, but in yellow letters. So it is actually, you can get mixed up and accidentally buy the stereo version. And the stereo version still sounds okay, but of course it's stereoizing mono tracks. The gatefold has some nice liner notes with your track listings, and you get a pretty nice band shot in here. I was really happy to find this upgrade copy. The condition of the jacket's really great because there's a little tiny bit of browning on the very edge, but the rest is just really in nice shape. And again, the actual inside of the gatefold hasn't turned brown, which is very great because usually when you find these US MGM releases, while the cardstock's a little thicker, they definitely are much more prone to wear and tear, and he's got knocked about for 40, 50 years. So really happy I finally found a nice upgrade copy because, again, my first copy was one of the first records I ever bought. I was not really, knowledgeable about checking condition and groove wear, and particularly for 60s records, groove wear is a really big concern, which it's not always visible to the naked eye when you're looking in a store, but you have to keep in mind these records we played on turntables back in the day that might have coins taped to the needles or be on big old console stereo units with gigantic needles that look more like nails. So groove wear is a very big concern, and so I was very happy to find a nice, clean upgrade copy of this title because, again, it's a really important title for me, and I spun my old copy a million times because, again, it was one of the first records I ever bought. The rear, I think, is somewhat iconic as well. Nice big headshots of all the band members in full color, and again, I spent a lot of time looking at this jacket over and over again. Here is the classic 60s black label MGM label, or should you say black MGM label? That makes more sense. And again, I have heard from some that if you find the very early copies of this, it will have a glossy black label. The dead wax seems to indicate this is already a reissue. It says RE2, so maybe this is the second cutting. They went through, of course, a huge print run on these. I don't even know what my first copy was in terms of the numbering or anything, but again, that is something to note. Apparently, the very early copies have a nice glossy label. I would love to find one of those someday just to see if there is a difference, but I mean, the sound on this thing is still really great. Side one kicks off with It's My Life, which has the really in-your-face bass opening, and yeah, it will really come across your stereo system, even though this is a 1960s mono US pressing. Really great sound on here, even though ostensibly it would be better on original UK 45s and LPs. Again, I do I did finally manage to get House of the Rising Sun on the original UK 45, and it sounds phenomenal, but I have to listen through a wall of crackle because, again, you think finding 60s vinyl is hard, getting it in good shape. Try get 45s. That's a whole other ball game. But this is the great starting off point. And again, anytime you talk about the Animals, they are an exceptionally difficult band to collect. So there's so many variations in the CD era and remasters and reissues. But to me, I think this is the best starting off point, and it sounds phenomenal. But the key is getting it in good condition. I also think this is truly one of the great records, even though it's a compilation. This is a great example of a compilation that stands the test of time and in a lot of ways essentially became one of the band's albums, which of course the original Animals lineup was rather short-lived because shortly after this point, I should say, they of course split and broke up, and then we had the various new Animals and Eric Burdon side projects and so on and so forth. So this kind of is a fork in the road of sorts in terms of the band's history. Next up is the MGM release of their Animals album, Animalization. And it is rather difficult to find any of the U.S. Animals albums in this day and age. They don't turn up all the time. Usually when they do, they're beat to crap. And you also have to be careful that you don't get a stereoized version. This is a mono copy, and it's in pretty decent shape, and the cover's in nice shape too. So I picked it up on a whim. Again, there is some difference between the U.S. releases and the original UK albums in terms of track listings and, what was a single and what was on an album. So again, it's like the Beatles US albums. They're totally different from the UK editions. Sometimes they kept the same name, but, this has completely different cover art. So, but you especially don't come across the later US ones. So this was a nice find. Again, conditions not super great, but, it's like a really nice mono copy in about, at least very good shape with some moments of very good plus. So I was happy to pick it up, especially since the cover's in nice shape. Of course, nice is relative. There's a bit more wear on the back with the usual black and white printing of a 60s jacket. You get some different songs on here. Some of the singles are on here, and some of the, at least one or two songs from the Best Of compilation. But again, it's getting exceptionally difficult to track down clean copies of even just the Animals US albums on MGM. Same standard MGM label. Again, condition on this is not as good as my upgrade copy of the Best Of. You're going to kind of be limited with what you find in terms of these releases ever turning up, because again, they don't turn up all the time, and usually when they do, they're beat to crap, or they're the stereoized version, which are usually also beat to crap. And most record stores know they're not as common, so they're a bit more on the pricier side. But anytime I see a mono copy of something like this pop up, and it's in nice shape, and it's like this was only a couple bucks, I was like, okay, yes, one more. And then I haven't found any since. So, every once in a while one turns up. Next up is the reunion album from 1983. This is entitled Arc. Brings back pretty much the original lineup. Of course, there's many lineups of the Animals, and they had a tumultuous lineup history for sure. This was an interesting find. I had actually forgotten they did a semi-reunion album in the 80s. Really interesting cover art, and this was actually still sealed, so it's got the shrink, still has the original hype sticker and everything. It had already worn off the corner, but this was a really nice find for like $2 or $3, and of course, really great sound quality. And it's on the IRS label, which I hadn't realized. And of course, I see IRS, I immediately think of REM because that's how I knew of IRS and their first 5 albums. And of course, the classic silver label and the classic IRS logo with the guy in suit and tie looking like a agent of sorts. And I really love any sort of vinyl release that IRS did, because practically everyone I've ever come across, regardless of who it was or what year it was in the 80s, is just a phenomenally well-made pressing, no frills. And a lot of times they used Quiex on a lot of their releases and titles, and just always loved IRS as a label. Sadly, this is not Quiex, but it does have the standard classic, at least classic to me, silver IRS label with the Agent Man logo and that sort of nice dark maroon. Really nice pressing on this, really nice sound quality and everything. So again, anything that's on the IRS label that I'm even remotely interested in and it's in good shape and inexpensive, I just go ahead and pick it up, because again, I love this label. And the pressings they had for everything are just almost always knocking it out of the park. There's no inner, but it does have the classic standard IRS pouch that gives you the ad for, send a couple bucks in with a postcard and we'll send you an IRS t-shirt. And of course, it's just literally thrown over the head logo, which I always thought was kind of cute. So you do see this on a number of 80s IRS releases where they just have this simple plastic inner, but with an ad to get your free t-shirt. I usually group together the solo albums of, members of a particular band I'm interested in. I usually try to group them together, just after that band. So that's where I'll have most of the solo records mixed in. This is Eric Burdon's solo album, I Used to Be an Animal, cheeky title, from 1988. Pretty nice cover shot. This also was sealed and picked up in a store sale, and it's in really nice shape. Again, it's not often that I buy sealed records because there is always the possibility of having warpage, and usually people charge more for them because they immediately think sealed, oh, that must mean it's worth more. But, again, you never quite know what a sealed record's going to be like. So usually I don't pay for the premium lottery chance to see what the sealed record is like, because I've been burned before, and I've also had excellent, things happen before. So, usually I just go with a standard copy if possible. But, sometimes, you come across a nice sealed copy. So this is on the Striped Horse label, which I'm not really familiar with outside of this release. But what's really great about this is it was mastered by the great Wally Trogett, who primarily worked at Capitol. And, of course, usually that's why his masterings will say mastered at Capitol with a little stamp, and then he will sign it with his Wally signature, which is here in the dab wax on both sides. So it's another one of the great engineers you can look for. He would either sign out Wally or WLY or something, but if you see his name anywhere with the mastered at Capitol stamp, you've got a really nice piece of wax. Again, one of the great engineers. So this does sound really, really nice. I don't have too many jazz records, which is something I hope to, address in the next couple years. And I'd really like to get more into collecting jazz records hardcore. But of course, it's a whole different realm and much more on the, rock, classic rock, alternative, new wave, 80s, sort of side of things. But I do have a couple jazz records mixed in, and this one's a really nice piece that I got in a trade with somebody. This is the Genius of Louis Armstrong compilation from Columbia, released sometime in the 70s, and they did a number of these in sort of volume sets, and also these are all in the original mono form, so they're not stereo remixes or anything. And if you just want a nice compilation set of Louis Armstrong or some of the other artists they did a really nice one for Billie Holiday. Some of these started in the 60s, like there was a nice Billie Holiday set, and I think 62 or so is a 3 LP box, and then eventually by the 70s they did them in individual single and double LP volumes, kind of working off of that pre-existing compilation. So I think this kind of goes hand in hand with that, and it's entitled as a volume 1, so I do believe there is at least a second volume. So this is basically materials primarily from the 20s and 30s, and for what it is in the era, it sounds really excellent. And to go back any further than this on these compilations for jazz, you're going to have to start getting into, earlier releases. They're going to be a lot harder to find, and then eventually get most likely into 78 records for, stuff from this era especially. And that's, a whole other realm of record collecting. Most turntables don't run 78 RPM. You need to have special styli for 78 records, and it's a whole different mentality because the chances of finding a near mint 78 record is it's not really going to happen. So these releases are a really great way to get nice untouched but yet also slightly cleaned up transfers as close as they could get to the source at the time period in the 70s. So again, these are a really nice way to jump into jazz and jump into the work of some of the greats, and I would love to get more of these particular series releases from the 70s. So you get this nice gatefold with a ton of liner notes. It's literally just a gatefold full of liner notes, and you get the credits for each, all the track listings with all the credits across all four sides. Again, this is a really nice double LP set. And here's the rear. The cover has a little bit of damage and wear and tear and ring wear, of course, but it's otherwise in really nice shape. And again, I got this in a trade with somebody, and it was a really nice welcome surprise. And now I really want to find more of these. Not exactly sure of the year this was produced, but it would be more likely in the mid to late 70s because this has the traditional circle Columbia logo with the yellow Columbia around in a circle. So I would assume this was sometime in the 1970s. Next, we jump into super 80s territory. This is the Asia self-titled album, and you know, very, very 80s, very, much, radio staples that still pop up to this day. But the sound quality on this is really, really nice. This is a great LP to pick up for, not too terribly much for a couple bucks. And this was in really exceptional shape, practically pristine. And still in the original shrink with the hype sticker and the really nice art that is still definitely frameable, but it sounds really, really great. So this is an easy, cheap title to recommend for people to pick up if this is sort of your thing, or even if you're, you kind of like the radio staples. They sound, incredible on this original pressing. It's a release on the Geffen label, and I'm not sure who mastered this for sure, but it was apparently recorded at the Townhouse Studio in London, so it is possible the UK pressing of this sounds as good or better, but I don't see how it can sound much better than this because it sounds really, really great. Here's the inner with band shots, and then the reverse with band logo. Here it is on the Geffen label. Again, I'm not sure who did the mastering, but it does carry a Sterling credit, so apparently it was somebody at Sterling Studios who mastered this, but it sounds really, really great. So easy, common title to recommend if you're looking for great sounding 80s records that aren't going to break the bank. So if you have the first Asia album, of course, you have to get the follow-up, Alpha, from 1983. This one, super nice shape and the original shrink with the hype sticker, and even has an old sales sticker from the record bar saying it's $6.49. I actually paid far less for this. This was, again, a nice find in dollar bins. So you can find albums that people today may not be as interested in, but if you're willing to give them a chance, you can have really awesome fun times, or even just enjoy it a few times and then put it back on the shelf as you bulk up your collection. But again, if you're gonna have the first Asia album, you might as well get Alpha as well. Really nice art, of course, and again, really super minty copy in the original shrink, so of course I was picking this up. Here's the inner with band shots, and the flip side gives you your lyric sheet. Again, on the Geffen label, this one is mastered by Greg Allman, who worked at the Artisan Studios. You can always identify his cuts, and he did a lot of stuff for Geffen. But he also did a lot of stuff throughout the 80s, but primarily you'll see it his signature on Geffen releases. So you'll see the little circle within a circle, which has what looks like two drumsticks coming up at the bottom of it, and a GF for Greg Allman. And of course, what would any collection be without the man, the myth, the legend, the Rick Astley, with the now immortal album Whenever You Need Somebody, which of course is the source of the infamous Never Gonna Give You Up, which is a song I already loved as a kid, even despite its sublime goofiness. This was given to me as a joke by somebody, and I've brought it out many times. It's a little beat up, but you will pay a bit of a premium for a copy of this now, simply because of the Rickroll movement, which is still absolutely hysterical and amazing that Rick Astley turned into internet sensation. So there you have it. As far as an album, not really something I would listen to normally, but again, this was given to me as a gift, and I've always loved the song, so I figured why not keep it. This, sound-wise, it's actually quite nice, and definitely sounds amazingly better than the versions of the song you hear on YouTube. But yeah, of course, it's just one of those titles that's now gained a life of its own. It's the original inner with lyric sheet and photos, and the flip side. I love it most about this release is you have a whole old-fashioned 60s write-up about the genius and majesty of the Rick Astley. And of course, this is long before what the internet did to the Rick Astley, and I just always find write-ups like that really endearing in a goofy way. So this, of course, is on the standard black RCA Victor label. Not sure who mastered this. There's no credit, but it does carry a master disc stamp. So it was mastered at Masterdisc, just not sure who did it. Again, sound-wise, it sounds quite good. So, if you really wanted to hear Never Gonna Give You Up sound a lot better, picking up this release will, set you on a really nice path. Again, it sounds great. Not necessarily what I'd listen to normally, but again, that song is just undeniably great. Of course, I say that with good reason because afterwards I actually bought the 12-inch maxi single of Never Going to Give You Up, which you have here. The cover's nice enough, and I'm a sucker for 12 inches because you get usually more space for having, more dynamic cuttings and, more groove space. Technically means more fidelity. Usually our releases here in the States would be at the standard 33 and a third RPM. What I love most are the British and European 12 inches and maxis and from the 80s, because those are usually at 45 RPM, so you get that nice boost in fidelity from a 45 cut, and usually would have extra songs or 12-inch mixes and things. So I really love those. This is an example of a really nice US maxi single because not only do you get the song, but you get actually a really good extended version, which is cheekily enough called the cake mix of the song. That's one of my favorite extended mix titles. Usually they would just say 12-inch mix or extended mix, but yes, this is the cake mix. You also very awesomely get an instrumental. So if you ever wanted to hear the song without the lyrics, well, here you go. And then side B gives you two versions of a different mix. So you also get the benefit of getting dance remix versions of the song. Again, pretty nice jacket. This is the best way to hear the song, I would argue. Standard RCA label still. This is in much better condition than my copy of the album, of course. But as you can see, much bigger grooves for the song, so the fidelity is increased. It is a different mastering, doesn't have the master disc stamp on it, so take that for what you will. But I'm just a sucker for really great 12-inch releases. So once again, I felt the power of the Rick. This was a really cool bin find. This was a 50-cent 12-inch. Of course, of the other notable, iconic Rick Astley hit single from the same album, this is Together Forever with the matching shot from the cover of the Whenever You Need Somebody album. If you have the Never Gonna Give You Up single, you have the Whenever You Need Somebody album, you might as well get the Together Forever 12-inch. Unlike the Never Gonna Give You Up 12-inch, this doesn't actually have the hit single or album version of the song. It's just remixes plus a B-side. So you get two versions of a new remix, one extended, a second mix altogether different on side 2 plus a B-side. It does have a master disc stamp. Not sure who did the mastering. The dead wax is pretty large, so I think they could have tucked in the standard version of the song, but they just obviously decided not to. I really wish they would do that more often on 12 inches though, because sometimes they would just put nothing but remixes on, and I do really enjoy having the standard version of a song on a 12-inch, so that way you get to compare the difference and get the improved fidelity of having the song on a 12-inch, because again, you get to devote more space to a single track as opposed to being stuck on an album side. Next, we have Atlanta Rhythm Section with their classic 1978 record, Champagne Jam, this on the Polydor label. I actually just found this recently. I've been trying to find an original copy of this because usually you just find club copies or represses that don't have the original mastering. This is another Bob Ludwig mastering. Sounds phenomenal. He did most of their albums on vinyl, which you don't come across some of the later ones as often, but Champagne Jam is relatively common. Again, a little bit kind of out of my usual wheelhouse, but my mom was a big ARS fan, had a lot of their cassette tapes when I was growing up, so I heard their stuff pretty frequently. I think mostly I heard their greatest hits cassette a lot. So some of these songs I actually knew quite more than I realized, but I picked up several of their albums when they've turned up in nice shape, particularly because I had some memory of it, and again, also realized that they were mostly Bob Ludwig mastering. So this is a really nice sounding LP. So definitely track down this original Polydor issue. And this one has a some slight embossing on the cover with the logo of the band and a nice glossy sleeve. So it was really nice to find this in good shape and, find the cover not beat up. I have owned a copy of this before that was not an RL version, but I eventually traded it away and then finally found a proper RL cut, and it sounds really, really nice. So here it is on the Polydor red label with the absolutely necessary Master Disc RL in the dead wax. I should mention it's credited as mastered by Rodney Mills and Bob Ludwig, and I just double checked the dead wax. It's just a Master Disc stamp, but I think it still technically counts as an RL cut, and it's usually referred to as such. I don't know if there's any hand-signed copies out there with his on it. I just know the other copies I've had were like a different cutting, and there's also the Record Club version as well. But yeah, definitely seek out an original pressing of this. Sounds really, really nice. And they are a rather underrated band, and their main heyday around this time period are just really nice, solid jam records for sure. Next is their 1979 album Underdog. This is a really nice condition copy with the original hype sticker, and it's actually not just a promo, but it's a white label promo, which means it was, designed and sent out to radio stations and DJs in really exceptional shape. It's got this really nice textured cover, and again, the band logo is embossed. Also on the Polydor label, really nice sound on this, and this one is an RL cut. Here you have the usual promotion-only stamp up here on the top. The rear is also textured, so the whole jacket is nicely textured. Here is the Polydor white label promo. If you're not aware, white label promos are a particular form of promotional record copies that be printed with a white label to further distinguish them as early promotional only copies, not meant or intended for general sale. And just like promotional standard copies, these are generally viewed as going to be the earliest copy you can get from the earliest stamper, and so they can be very desirable among record collectors looking for the absolute first pressing of a release. Doesn't always mean that they are the end-all, be-all, very first pressing. Sometimes they just weren't, but it is, indicative of a very early release, and you may come across promos, but it's very rare you come across white label promos, particularly the further back you go in vintage, and particularly not in amazing shape like this. So I don't think this was played more than once or twice. It's in immaculate shape. The reason why I really wanted to pick up this album, as the hype sticker indicates, this has their cover of the classic song Spooky, and it's one of the great cover versions of any song. So it's worth the whole album simply for that one cover version. And it is a nice, solid album as well with, again, Bob Ludwig mastering. So you do have the Master Disc RL and the Dead Wax run out, which, again, that is the sign of sublime excellence with his signature on there. So get the best of everything here on a white label promo. And a really cool find because I found this for, $2. So that was really cool. What's also cool is the original insert is here, which promotes the band's prior albums. And it has a detachable mail-away envelope on the bottom, which you could put a check in for your baseball cap, running shorts, t-shirts, baseball jersey, belt buckle, poster, or my personal favorite, getting the lighter with the band's logo on it, which is not something you see all the time. I guess it was a more common thing to do back in this era because, of course, there were a lot more smokers everywhere, but still, usually not what you see in one of these mail-away things. I've seen like the, Reckless album has the tie-in to get the video. Usually you find stuff for t-shirts, posters, maybe baseball caps, belt buckles a little weird, but the cigarette lighter that just really cracks me up. But of course this was never used, and this is actually a detachable envelope, so they were nice enough to give you an envelope with the band logo on it. I just found this recently along with the Champagne Jam copy I just showed. This is their 1981 album Quinella. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm terrible with pronunciations. This one is nowhere near as common. I've never actually seen it in the used bins before. It has a couple songs from that greatest hits cassette I mentioned before that I remember from growing up. So I figured, might as well pick it up since I was getting the other. And again, it was a really nice, cheap bin find and pretty nice shape. Of course, the other major selling point is it credits Bob Ludwig for the mastering at Masterdisc, which, again, you see his name on a jacket, and it's, a couple bucks. I'm buying it just because, his cuttings are that good. But anyway, like a number of other albums where he's credited, didn't necessarily sign all of them. So this one just has the master disc stamp, but it doesn't have his signature on it. So it still is a RL cut, but it's not signed. So you just have to, look at the credits on the sleeve if there are sometimes, but then there are times where there's just no credit and you just have a stamp. So this is not an exact science, but sometimes you have to do a little detective work on the jacket or sleeve just to make sure and try and figure out who mastered it, because it's not always signed. And this one is just on the standard Columbia label. We're finally out of the A's, so moving on to the B's, have to start with, of course, the B-52s. This is their second album, Wild Planet, on the Warner Brothers label. I would love to get their first album, but it's rather difficult to come across. Usually I find copies that are beat up, and hopefully I can find a nice condition copy at some point, which I finally did on Wild Planet here. And I know some people say the British version of the self-titled is really great, so some people prefer the British version. I've just never gotten to compare the two, but I will say from what I've experienced with this and other releases of theirs that I've heard, that for their albums, it really doesn't nothing compares to these original pressings. The songs on here just leap out of the wax, whereas on a lot of the compilations or the Time Capsule Best of CD compilation sounds pretty decent, but you can definitely tell there's some loudness compression going on, whereas here they sound even better. And that one's not smashed by any means, but that already sounds good. But those particular songs sound phenomenal on this. Really, really nice mastering. It's not credited to anybody, but it does have Sterling stampers, so it is a nice sign of good sound for the most part, usually. Of course, the sleeve is done to pretty much mimic and match what's on the self-titled album with the classic yellow sleeve. And it does kind of follow in the same fashion as the self-titled album in terms of the feel and the sort of, even right down to the track sequencing. If I did have to pick a favorite B-52 song, which is very, very difficult, it's actually on here. So if I had to pick one, it would probably be Strobe Light, just because of the absolute indescribable magic, particularly of their early couple albums with these songs that are really like nothing else. So again, if I had to pick a favorite, it would be that, which is on this album. It is on the standard Warner label. Again, you don't come across these all too often, and usually when you do, they're a little pricey regardless of condition. So I was very happy to find a super minty copy of their second album, and hopefully pick up the first and just go ahead and get the whole major run before getting into the CD era, because it's so much fun going back to the B-52's catalog. And if you ever find particularly any of their early albums, this one, for example, or the self-titled, in really nice shape, just go ahead and pick it up. You will have a blast, and it's always great coming back to their music, because again, you just forget how much fun these records are. So this is the only other 52s record I have. This is the maxi 12-inch single of their song Summer of Love from 1986, and they have a number of really cool 12 inches and EPs and such in addition to the album. So this has a number of extended remixes and stuff. What's also really great is, like I mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of British and European 12 inches because they cut things at 45 RPM. Well, this is a Warner release, and it is cut at 45 RPM. So there are certain select US 12 inches that are at the even better 45 speed. So, if I see that, I'm like, yes, here's my money. This is still in the shrink, in nice condition, but it is one of those 12 inches where, it is cut as a normal jacket, but the opening is actually here on the top. So, of course, when you file it, you have to turn the jacket sideways to have the spine facing out. Side 1 gives you a extended party mix of the song, and then side 2 gives you another mix plus the actual single original version, which, again, I'm always happy when they do that, because I like to be able to have everything on the same 12-inch and be able to compare, on the same side. It just has Sterling stampers. I'm not sure who mastered it, but the sound is quite nice. And again, it's cut at 45 RPM, which makes me really happy. So this was a blind buy from the Dollar Bins. This is the Baby's Head First album from 1978. I picked it up primarily because I'm more familiar with their big album, but nice cover, nice Dollar Bin copy, and it's a pretty solid record. Show you the rear here on the Chrysalis label. And this is a mastering from the Mastering Lab, so it does have the classic Mastering Lab TML stampers. So this is the album most people will know the Babys for. This is, of course, their Union Jacks album from 1980, also on Chrysalis, which had the giant monster hit single Back on My Feet Again, which is still, you occasionally hear it on radio or see it licensed every once in a while. Nice looking cover, and again, this is one of those albums I grew up hearing a lot because my mom had it on tape and then got it on CD and wore it out, so I heard it a lot. So getting this brought back some memories, and since I got this, I got the other album as well. You can find this for pretty cheap. It's rather common. Pretty nice jacket. I like that they had this motif of the zipper on a leather jacket. And on the Chrysalis label, this one is mastered at Artisan by Gregg Allman again, and I believe the sleeve credits somebody else as well, but it has his signature with the Artisan logo on the dead wax. Actually, I found this not too long ago. This is the John Waite solo album No Breaks from 1984 with the giant hit single Missing You, which still pops up all the time. Really nice jacket, got some slight gloss on it, but I picked it up because it's super minty and is, as you can see, a promo copy, and I'm a sucker for those. So anytime it's an album that, again, even has a few notable songs and it's a buck or two, and especially it's a minty promo copy, I'm going to buy it because I'm a sucker for promo copies. So this is on EMI with a pretty standard looking back cover, but with the black and red text, it reminds me of things also from the 80s, like, for example, Robert Palmer's Heavy Nova album, which also has a white sleeve with black and red text. So the inner with your photos and lyric sheet. So this is on the standard EMI America label of the 80s with the sort of light grayish background. It has sterling stampers, and the sleeve credits it as being cut by George Marino at Sterling Sound, another one of the great engineers. This thing sounds really, really nice, so I do believe it is indeed a George Marino cut since it does have the sterling stampers. So really, really nice sounding release, and most 80s records are going to sound really, really great, unless, it's a not such a great recording to begin with, but if you can live with 80s production values and the production style of a lot of 80s records, if you're okay with that, or if you're still a fan of that production style, for the vast majority of 80s records do sound phenomenal and have great mastering, and this, of course, is long before the days of the loudness wars, so you can pick up releases like this in mint shape for a couple bucks and, have a really nice listening session. This one really needs no introduction. This, of course, Bad Company's self-titled debut album from 1974, really one of the great classic debut albums, Bad Company being one of the first truly major, huge super groups out there. And this is such an incredibly solid, phenomenal record that if you haven't heard it before or you've never owned a copy, you just really need to get one and experience it for the first time. Of course, filled with monster hit singles you still hear on the radio every single day, but when heard in context on the album, so much incredibly better. The cover itself, it's very straightforward, rather iconic in a lot of ways, brilliant jacket design, and this is a gatefold with a very nice stylized band shot, which of course screams 70s like nothing else. This is in really nice shape, but that's also because this is actually a reissue pressing, probably from about 1977 or so. The original copies would have been cut at the Mastering Lab, so that's why it credits that on here, which is what's on the original rear. It's on the Swan Song label, which also famously housed Led Zeppelin. This was, of course, recorded in some of the same locales as Zeppelin did, so it has that really beautiful, spacious sound, which, the mastering of this album, people have different opinions on which they prefer. A lot of people love the first UK pressing because, of course, it was recorded in the UK. Some people like the German pressing, and I'd love to get some of those to compare because I'm sure they sound incredible. There was also the Audio Fidelity Gold CD that was mastered by the great engineer Steve Hoffman. That was in I believe the mid-2000s. That's also a great sounding version. The original U.S. copy, pressed at the cut at the mastering lab, should sound pretty good. But what's great about this one, and what I thought was really interesting, again, this is a repress from about 1977, but it's also one of those that, because this album sold thousands and thousands of copies, they had to recut it. And in the mid to late 70s, a lot of albums were recut, but sometimes by some of the really great engineers and some different ones. And George Piros did a number of recuts in the 70s for Atlantic and other labels. He recut a lot of the Zeppelin albums, and some of those are really real sleeper titles. For example, he did a recutting of Led Zeppelin 1 in about 1975 or so it's on the Atlantic label. And that thing sounds so incredible that I think it's the definitive Zeppelin 1, and it's not very well known, and we'll get to that one when I get to the L section, and I'm talking about my Zeppelin collection. But he did a number of these cuts of reissues that sound really, really great. So sometimes the reissue is a worthwhile choice. Sometimes it can be even better than the original. And I bring that up because here is the label, and this is indeed a George Piros recut and sounds really, really great. Again, I don't have an original Mastering Lab copy to compare this to, and I'd actually like to do that someday, to do a shootout between this, the TML original US version, and then, say, the UK first pressing, just to, finally do a shootout and compare them side by side by side. But, for the time being, this is a super minty copy. Don't pass up on this 1977 repress if you come across it. Again, jacket's in great shape. Really nice sonics on this, iconic album. So highly recommended, even though it isn't the original 1974 pressing. Should also mention that this particular copy, as you can see on the catalog number on the bottom, this is pressed at the Monarch plant, so that makes it even slightly more desirable in audiophile circles, because there's now such a, getting Monarch copies is a coveted thing. Again, some people can purport to see differences between Monarch copies and other plants. Most of the time, it's usually going to be only if there was a difference in the tapes they mastered from, but getting the copy with the lovely MO call letters is a really nice, cool thing to see when you just unearth it from the jacket. And again, this is super minty, so I was very happy to get a good copy of this finally. So of course, have to have the follow-up, Straight Shooter. This was a really great find a couple years ago. I found this in the bins. $2 for an original copy, still in the shrink wrap. Absolute mint condition. I was really shocked to just find this sitting there. Of course, the original art with the tumbling dice carried over onto the rear, also on the Swan Song label. The inner is original, nice band shot here, keeping the theme of the jacket, and it's actually the sort of thicker cardstock instead of being a paper sleeve, which, if the album isn't abused a lot, that usually keeps vintage records in, much prettier shape than if it was just a generic paper sleeve. And of course, gotta have the rear shot. Like the first album, this is another Monarch copy with their MO there, and then the dead wax has their MR in a circle, which is how they would stamp their dead wax. This is cut at the Mastering Lab. It is an original copy of the album. Not sure who did the mastering, but it is a Mastering Lab cut. Sounds quite lovely on this, and again, some of these songs you've heard on the radio a million times they have a whole new life on this original pressing for sure. So continuing on with Bad Company, this is their Burnin' Sky album, and I've tried to pick up their later records post the first two whenever I've come across them, but it's actually gotten more and more difficult to find even the lesser known later albums that are, without as many of the big hit singles. Because usually you find them traded in the bins and they're, beat to crap or taken a lot of wear and tear over the years and have a, $5 to $10 sticker on them where, it should be more like a $3 to maybe $5 sticker on them. So it took me a while to find a nice copy of this, which has this really nice striking cover. Of course, no information on the front other than the band shot, but you do have the title on the spine. Really nice gatefold, although it's, there's no information whatsoever. It's very much an atmospheric gatefold. You're supposed to get the idea that, this is about a burning sky, literally. Like I said, I waited till I found one in really nice shape, so it's It's not quite a glossy sheen to it, but does have a sort of sheen on the jacket, so it's much more preferable to find one of these with a jacket that's not totally destroyed. Again, on the Swan Song label, and you get a nice sort of wraparound effect when you look at the exterior, like so. There's the nice custom inner. And again, on the Swan Song label, this is a copy stamp PR, which indicates it was pressed at the Presswell plant, and carries the Sterling stampers, so it does sound quite nice, but I'm not exactly sure who did the mastering on this. Next, we have their Desolation Angels album. This has a few more notable songs, so it's one that was a much more popular title. Usually turns up pretty beat up, and because it's got this white cover, you can see it has some kind of embedded dirt and where the white started to fade. So usually you will find copies of this where the jacket is, kind of dinged up and kind of yellowed or browned with age. But it's a nice gatefold. I picked this one up because the LP itself was in minty shape, and it was finally a copy that wasn't, marked up for no apparent reason. Again, going for the atmospheric gatefold effect, which, is quite nice. And because the photo runs the whole gatefold and is quite large, it gives you an idea. You could definitely set this behind your turntable while you were playing this album, and you get the atmospheric effect that I think the band desired. Now, strange enough about this particular one, if you look down here, it has the dreaded manufactured by Columbia House under license, meaning that this would be a jacket for a record club copy, which record club copies usually were cut from inferior tape masters or different tape masters, usually meaning that it was just not going to sound as good as the original pressing, from the original tape source and stuff like that. So usually you buy a record and then you take it home and you see it's, a club copy and you're like, no. But the reason why I went ahead and picked this up is I checked the LP, and sure enough, it is actually not a club pressing. So it's got a club pressing jacket, which should be identical to the standard one. But the actual LP is super minty and is definitely not a club pressing. So here we are on the Swan Song label again. This is actually a Monarch pressing, indicated by the MO in the catalog there. And the mastering was done by Strawberry. And this is a really nice sounding LP when you find a copy. Of course, finding a clean copy is the challenge because, again, it was a more popular album of the band's output. But yeah, it's a really nice, solid album, and not probably as well known as the first two, because the first two are just loaded with radio hits, but it's a really great, solid record with, one or two songs that have really still stayed on the radio for many, many years afterwards, and a really nice, solid, great sounding pressing, and really cool that it's a Monarch. It's the original inner, which is, again, one of the more thicker cardstock style sleeves, so that means usually if you find a copy of this where it wasn't too abused on the vinyl, it can usually survive a lot longer because it's in one of these cardstock sleeves. But if it was played a lot or taken in and out of the sleeve, that means it could get a lot of surface scuffs because, of course, there's no paper inner. Then finally, their Rough Diamonds album from 1982, also on the Swan Song label, and I just picked this up out of curiosity because I found it in a cheap bin, so this was just $1 or $2, and it's got this really cool die cut cover. It's not just die cut here, but it's die cut on the edge, and so you have this ripple effect, or I should say jagged effect, that actually is how the opening of the jacket is. So it was a really interesting design, and I'm sure if you come across copies of this, it's most likely going to have a lot of wear and dings because this just catches on everything. It's actually kind of hard to get your finger in there without, folding the cardstock any or crumpling it any. What's also cool is that when you slide the picture sleeve out, they actually put a little effect there, and I guess it's supposed to look very much like Vegas or a casino town because that's what all the photos and what the title seems to indicate. So it's a nice touch, a really nice jacket. I really appreciate the cover design on this. The rear is plain though. Again, here is the photo inner. It's, again, sort of a thicker cardstock, so not just a generic paper sleeve. And then the rear with the credits, and then I'll show you this put in the jacket this way because, of course, depending on which way you put the inner, it will give you a different cover image. So here's what it looks like if you put the photo insert in backwards. Not quite as good, but as you can tell, they at least paid some attention to what the images would look like. So, there's at least something in the little diamond holes if you put in the sleeve backwards. Again, on the Swan Song label, and the credits list the plant as being AR, which stands for the Allied Pressing Plant, which was in Los Angeles. Next up, we have the Bangles debut record, All Over the Place, and I love this album. If you've never heard it, never really gotten into the band all that much, give this one a shot. It's a really great, solid, phenomenal lost gem of the 80s, and really probably the most representative of how the band originally sounded and wanted to sound before, of course, the record company and management and others kind of tried to push and pull them into more of a, I guess you could say, pop-oriented direction, which, it's not to say their follow-up albums were bad. They're just, kind of, you can start to see there's a shift going on. And, I like the later albums, but this is the one that I really think you can hear their sound at its most, not necessarily raw, but at its most honest and upfront. And it's just one of those records that just gets into your head and you can't forget stuff. And it's got a lot of earworms, brilliant pop hooks and things, and some really great songwriting. So I still love this record. Really nice cover, and you don't see it all that often, but I was happy to find this because it's actually a promotional copy, which gets this nice, lovely little gold stamp here over the barcode, and it's really cool because I got this because I was able to match it to the next album we'll talk about, which is also a promo copy with also a similar gold stamp. So again, super happy to find this. Really nice shape. This is one of those albums that if you do manage to get a vinyl original copy, I don't really think you need to ever upgrade it because I've never heard another version sound this good, and it sounds really great. Really cool inner with a bunch of candid backstage and live shots of the band done in this cutout photo collage design, which I'm a sucker for stuff like this that gives you a sense of the band life and life on the road, stuff like that. Then the other side with some more credits and such. It doesn't say who did the mastering, but it does carry the Sterling stampers. It's got the Columbia Ring logo, which had pretty much taken over by the 70s, and of course is a little bit revamped for the 80s. And I'm not sure who did the mastering, but it does have Sterling stampers. Sorry, I should say it does have a custom message in the side one dead wax. It just says "See Haunt." I'm not sure what that refers to, but I always think it's cool when a band or somebody puts a custom message or custom information or witticism, whatever, in the dead wax. So if I come across any of those as we're going through these, I will just point it out, even if I have no idea what it means. Next, we have to have the Bangles' Different Light album, which is their follow-up and has probably, I think it's easy to say, they're probably their two biggest hit singles. So this will be the album that most people will be familiar with or own in their collections or owned back in the day. So much more common to find than the first album, but you can see the sort of shift into much more of an overt pop style. Again, still a solid record. I still prefer the first album and wish they had kind of been able to stick with more of that pop rock blending, but with that harder rock edge that was in the first album. It's a little bit, I guess, a little bit dulled, a little bit rolled off maybe, but it's still a great solid album and a really nice version to have. Again, I think, if you get original pressings of stuff like this from the 80s, don't really think it's been bettered. Of course, I don't have an original CD to compare to, but if I did, I'm sure it'd probably be a dead heat or maybe not quite as good as the original LP. And like I said, this is also an original promo copy, and they've tucked the gold stamp here over the barcode, just like All Over the Place. So I had found this first, and I was like, oh, cool, it's a promo copy, and it's super clean. And then I finally managed to find the first album, and lo and behold, it was a promo as well. So I love it when things match. Here's the inner, which is your lyric sheet, and then a little bit of credits and information. And again, most annoyingly, tells you everybody in the credits list, but it doesn't tell you who mastered it. So sometimes you just have no idea. And again, just on the standard 80s Columbia label. As I said before, and these videos will prove, I'm a giant sucker for 12 inches. So this was just a random find for a quarter. This is the 12-inch of the iconic Toni Basil hit Mickey. This is an extended 12-inch version, so it runs about 5 or so minutes. I'm not sure if it's just a complete re-edit or just a remix or, is a true definitive extended version, because they could label it with stuff back in the day, but until you actually compare and contrast between this and the, single hit version or album version, sometimes you can't tell until you directly compare them. But it's also backed with a Spanish language version, which I wasn't aware even existed. So again, it was super clean 12-inch extended cut of iconic single, and it was a quarter, so I bought it. The rear is the same, but promotes that there's the Spanish version as well. Here it is on the Chrysalis label. No mastering information, but as you can see, there's still quite a bit of dead wax left over, so they could have tucked in the actual single version of the song, which I wish they would have. I really enjoy that when they do it on 12 inches, and most do. If they have the space, they'll tuck in the song in the version that everybody knows, but here they didn't do that, so you just get a remix entitled the Special Club Mix, and I think it's kind of cool. They put the beats per minute on the label, so of course definitely intended probably more for club DJs. But I always think it's cool when they do that. It's not all the time, but you see that every once in a while on 12-inch releases. And then the flip side is just the Spanish version. So I do actually have the 2014 Beatles in mono box set, but that's so big and important and now unfortunately out of print. I'm just going to do that as a separate video because that's something that I wish everybody had been able to get. It's so amazing that I feel like that needs a video in its own right. So going on just Beatles standalone releases, I only have this one, which is the 1978 Let It Be British UK reissue. That's actually pressed on white vinyl. This was done at the same time as the pretty well-known and iconic white vinyl pressing of the White Album, which a lot of audiophiles look at it and say is the best-sounding version of the stereo White Album. And I have heard some needle drop samples and things of some of the various ones. It's the version I would love to get someday, but of course is very expensive. The white vinyl White Album from '78 is one of my all-time vinyl holy grails for sure. So that's what I'd like to get for the stereo White Album someday. I was just going to try and get a UK Let It Be. I need to get it UK Let It Be and a UK first pressing Abbey Road. That way I would have the 3 albums in stereo that I needed to supplement the mono box, which of course has the rare alternate version of the White Album in mono. And unfortunately, the stereo vinyl pressings from 2012 were just not very good. So it's not like the mono series, which was just definitive for every title. So this was actually a find at the local record convention. One of the really great sellers I'd been to a few times before. Usually has some great stuff mixed in, and so he had a copy of this, and he was only asking $10 for it. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. This is the '78 white vinyl version. I know it's quite rare, and paying $10 for even a UK, let alone $10 for a US copy, is undervalued with what these go for now, regardless of condition. Of course, there was a condition, and it was because it did have some significant warpage, which I'm still trying to correct. But the playing surfaces are really clean, so I can track through a significant portion of the album on both sides. So it's not a complete washout, and the jacket's in really nice shape. Of course, the laminate is starting to peel a little bit, but it's otherwise super clean, and you do not come across these just at all. Most people are aware of the white vinyl White Album, but far fewer are aware of that there was a white vinyl pressing of Let It Be done at the same time in 1978. So you would pay $10 just for a cover of Let It Be this good. So I was just like, I'm not going to let this go because I will probably never find another one of these. Definitely not for $10. And here it is in all of its white vinyl glory. Looks really impressive. And of course, back in the day, in the 70s, they didn't really do a lot of colored vinyl. See, now everybody, does colored this and swirl this and all this weird stuff. And Jack White does whatever the heck he's going to do next. But, back in the day, for somebody to do a colored vinyl run was much more of a big cause of celebration because it was just not done all that often. And honestly, I think it looks more impressive because, I mean, I can't really tell you why, but it just always has looked more impressive to me when I see a white or red or green or particular color a vinyl pressing from the 70s or 80s compared to all the fantastical stuff we can get today. Probably simply because it was just so rarely done. And of course, you do have the original Green Apple label. The Dead Wax is still pretty much the original catalog number, but of course, this is a reissue from 1978. And it does sound exceptional, but unfortunately, you can see it a little here. But of course, because it's white, it's harder to see. But it's definitely got some warpage. I don't know how much it's going to come across from the camera angle, but that's why it was so cheap. But I think most places, most stores would have still tried to sell this for at least $50 or something. Copies of this usually are in the $125 range, or even higher, I think. They just don't pop up all that often, like the white vinyl White Album, but it was definitely just a surprise to find. And I was like, heck, for $10, I'm just going to give this a go. And like I said, I can at least get the inner three and a half tracks on both sides to play, and it sounds beautiful. So this is one where I've definitely been trying to combat the warp, and but it is a rarer title, so I don't know if I would still feel leery about trying to trust this to like a vinyl flat and popping it in the oven. But I might just have to do something like that to because otherwise it's a beautiful, beautiful pressing. Highly recommended if you want a great Let It Be. But normally this thing is extraordinarily pricey. Next up, we have Pat Benatar's debut album, In the Heat of the Night. This is a phenomenal, great 80s record. You can get it in most record stores for a couple bucks. It sounds phenomenal. It's super solid. Pretty much her entire 80s run, her first couple albums are all great, solid 80s records. They all sound great. Most records on the Chrysalis label always sound great. And even if the condition isn't super, super awesome, usually the music and mastering shines through beautifully. Here's the rear. Like a number of the early Blondie records, this was mastered by Steve Hall at MCA. Again, sounds wonderful. This album has finally been redone in a number of reissues and audiophile versions, but this original LP first issue, you can get it for a couple bucks. Sounds freaking phenomenal, and especially for $2 or $3. I did go through a number of copies on this one and some of the others because the first one I bought was a little noisy and stuff, and just I kept getting other cheap dollar bin copies, and then finally found this one, which is in super nice shape. Here's the Chrysalis label, and they sold bukus of this, so they did do a reissue as well. If you have the first, you have to have Crimes of Passion. Again, huge best-selling album, still sounds great, really solid, and again, I don't think you can really better the original pressing, and you can get one of these for a couple bucks. Of course, with the vinyl resurgence, the cost of everything has gone up, but you might have to go through maybe an upgrade copy or two until you find one that's like super clean, or of course wait for that inevitable one that you hopefully find one day that looks like it's never been played. And like we talked about a minute ago, this one actually, I've never seen one like this before where they just put, a club sticker, but it's literally a sticker they just stuck on a jacket. So this is just a plain original jacket, but they put this sticker on because I guess this was to be sold as a club copy, but the actual LP itself is an original pressing. So sometimes they would just do that and use like extra stock or send a certain bunch or batch to be used as club copies. Then what's really cool is you have a custom logo with Pat herself on there, and I just think it's a really cool image to have, and of course it looks even cooler when it's rotating around. This one was mastered at Artisan by Greg Foganati and others, so Artisan strikes again, and again, sounds really, really nice, and getting this for $2 or $3, I don't really think anything else compares sonically, and of course, hearing these big songs you've heard a million times before on the original pressing gives them a whole new life compared to, streaming or YouTube or commercial usage. Then we have the Precious Time album, which again, super solid, sounds great, and you really can't beat these stock original 80s pressings. Again, I really do think, especially with the strength of each of these, all of her early records, like I said, pretty much the entire 80s run, they're all solid and they're all extremely undervalued and underrated, I think. Every time I go back and listen to some of these again, you really do forget how strong they are. And even the radio hit cuts that you've heard a million times. And of course, they sound much better on these original pressings. This one actually gives you a lyric sheet. And then a nice photo enter. Again, this one is Greg at Artisan doing the mastering. And here's the label shot. This was a cool find. This is Big Audio Dynamite, which was, Mick Jones's big music effort, his band post his Clash time. And again, really great songs on here. And I had totally just kind of forgotten about, Big Audio Dynamite, or BAD for short. I hadn't thought about them in ages, and I found the CD copy of this album, the original stock 80s CD. Found it in a bin for a quarter, and I was like, oh, cool. And then literally like a week later found the LP version. So this, again, super nice shape. You don't see these practically ever. And it's actually a promo with the stamp up here, just like the Bangles album. So that was super cool. Jacket's in minty shape. And you get the nice custom inner, which looks super awesome with your lyric sheet printed on there as well. Great band shot. No mastering information, and it is a London, so UK recording. So I'm sure the UK pressing might be, a little better, but I'm not sure it may, have just shared the stamper master. Here's the label. It does have, in the dead box, it does have that this was mastered at the Sound Clinic, so I'm not sure if that matches what's on the UK stamper, but again, British band, British recording, so usually the British version is sometimes better. But by the 1980s, it's kind of a washout. It just depends. Sometimes they were the same, sometimes one is a little better than the other, but then sometimes they would literally just share the same master. So next up is a really, really tough to find item. It's gotten much more difficult to get a copy of this, especially, with how old it's getting. But this is a particularly interesting piece. So this, of course, is Blondie's self-titled debut album from 1976. Really solid, phenomenal first record. Really stands up. Iconic cover, which looks phenomenal. And this one's still in the original shrink, which I was super amazed to find just in not local store, but store I go to every once in a while that's still in the state. One of my all-time favorite record stores, and it was just literally in the bins there, and I was just shocked. And a little bit more than what I normally pay for used records, but since this is so unbelievably rare, the values just keep going up and up and up on this. So I was very happy to finally get a copy of this. So what makes this special is this was before Blondie was signed to Chrysalis Records, and of course, Chrysalis did much bigger print runs, and their albums got bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually they reissued this first album. So if you usually find it, it's a Chrysalis pressing and not the original first issue, which is on the private stock label. So the original private stock 1976 first issues of Blondie's first record are exceptionally difficult to find. They're real collector's items. It's said that there's really not a whole lot of difference between this and the Chrysalis pressing, but the idea is always trying to get the very first issue, and so the most desirable record to own, the most desirable version of this album to own, is the original private stock, which is what this is. So these are incredibly rare, hard to find these days, and I was just shocked to see one in such beautiful shape. Again, so got the original shrink on it, and it's nice and loose, so I left it on, which is why it still has the store stickers. And I guess this maybe was an original hype sticker where the hype part wore off, or a price sticker or something from back in the day, but just super amazed that I actually finally found one of these. Again, jacket is in phenomenal shape for the age and rarity of this album. And again, you can always tell it's a private stock because it literally has private stock on the rear jacket, whereas the Chrysalis reissue will have a Chrysalis logo and, of course, have the Chrysalis blue and white label like all the other Blondie records. So again, if you ever come across one of these, it's very tough to find even the repress. You don't see the first album all that often, and it doesn't get discussed as much as, say, Parallel Lines or the other more notable, more famous Blondie records, but there is a case to be made that this, is their purest record, maybe their best. It's debatable, but it's right up there, and one of the great albums of what could be termed the emerging, trying to think of the right word, but Blondie was right in there with the American first wave of punk bands, and as all this stuff was just kind of percolating in the New York scene. So really phenomenal record, amazing to find the original private stock copy of this. And you can also tell the private stock label has this sort of airbrush brown effect. This was mastered by Gregg Allman at Sterling Sound, another one of the phenomenal legendary engineers, so it sounds phenomenal. Again, I would like to compare this to a Chrysalis reissue someday just to see if there is that big of a difference. Again, I've read on forums online that they're supposed to be pretty close, but the general consensus is you want to try and find the private stock version simply because it is that hard to find in the definitive, first issue of this record. So super excited to find one of these. And, I did pay $25 for this. It's in super minty shape. But, prices on this have gone up even since then. So you'd be lucky to find a copy of this for, less than $50, if not less than $75 now, because as we're going up in time, it's getting harder and harder to find stuff like this. And of course, with the vinyl resurgence that's made, prices skyrocket across the board. So really fantastic piece. A real centerpiece to any Blondie collection or any, collection of New York late 70s records, really essential and just tough to find in any edition, but particularly this original private stock label, which is the one to go for. So, of course, we have Parallel Lines, and this one has a bit of a checkered history in terms of editions, represses, reissues, and such, because once the album came out and got really, really big, they very, very quickly switched out the version of Heart of Glass from the album cut, which was only on the very first pressings and test copies and promos, so on and so forth, for the longer version that's usually titled the disco single version. So it's very, very extremely tough to find an original pressing. About 90% of copies you come across will have the remix or the longer version of Heart of Glass instead of the original album cut. So this was the first copy I picked up. I've never taken the price stickers off because it looked like it was starting to take some of the cover laminate off, so I just left those on. Sometimes I kind of leave some of the stickers on just in case. Same thing with books where they have really cheap laminate on like a paperback cover because I don't want to risk damaging the cover or anything. It's in pretty nice shape. Again, this was the first copy I picked up, but it actually does on the label credit it as being the original album cut by having the Heart of Glass with the original album track time. But as I'll tell you in a second, that's actually quite deceptive. So here's the rear, of course, already on the Chrysalis label, and they sold thousands and thousands of this album, so you can find it pretty often. It's getting tougher to find a good condition copy. It hasn't been played to death, and also that some store isn't charging you $10 or $15 for. Really essential album. If you had one Blondie album, it would have to be this one. Although I really love the first album and I like some of their other records, but this is like the one that is the essential one, the one that everybody's going to know with most of all the big songs on it, and it's solid, phenomenal, start to finish. Here's your lyric sheet, again keeping the black and white alternating stripe theme of the jacket. And then here's the flip side with your credit information. This was mastered by, again, Steve Hall at the MCA studio. Sounds really great, phenomenal, far better than any of the, later compilations or the, 1 billion times you've heard one way or another licensed in TV or commercials or, Heart of Glass as well. But as I was saying before, I picked this up because, I looked at the label and lo and behold, it had the proper shorter album cut of Heart of Glass, which, flip over here to side B, And if you look, it's got the correct credit for the album version at 3 minutes 54 seconds. But as I said before, that's really deceptive because this actually has the disco single version that runs about 5 some odd minutes. So when I first played this, I thought, oh, well, I've got the correct one. And it wasn't until, sometime later when I pulled it out and played it again, I'm like, wait a minute. And then eventually I picked up a super minty copy of the one that's marked having the disco version because it was minty and super cheap. And this one has a little bit of noise. It's not in the best of condition, but it was just the first copy I picked up. And that's how I realized all of a sudden, wait a minute, this just has the wrong label. And in the dead wax, it's got some information crossed out and it's got the new number written on with a RE for reissue. So apparently this was just the, most often found edition, the second edition, but they reused the first pressing labels. And so you can't just go by the labels. You literally just have to actually play the album and compare it with the dead wax because it seems like finding a original copy with the original version of Heart of Glass is darn near impossible. I know it exists on white label promo pressings and like the original promo stamped pressings that would have been sent to DJs and radio stations, but I have never physically found an original LP that was the, true first pressing with the album version of Heart of Glass. So here's the aforementioned second copy I picked up. Again, picked it up because this is dead mint, still in the shrink, still has the hype sticker, which, hypes this contains the longer, uncensored disco version of the hit single Heart of Glass, i.e. the version that practically 99% of copies of this record are stuck with. And I like it. It's still the same song, but it's not the original album version. And if I'm going to listen to the album, I would wish it and prefer it to have the original intended album cut and not the longer, slightly extended version. I wish there was a 12-inch with all the different versions on there. I know there's like a 12-inch and some 7 inches, of course, because it was a huge single, but I just haven't tracked any of those down yet. So anyway, this is in perfect mint shape. Original jacket. Again, you don't come across this record in this kind of condition. So I'm really glad I picked it up a few years ago. Again, everything else is the same. You can see the inner in super awesome shape. Here's the label. And again, this is in phenomenal condition. So I don't think anything was changed. It still seems to indicate that this is, a first stamper for side 1. But then when you flip over to side 2, if you look on side B there, it does credit Heart of Glass as being the disco version and running a little bit over 5 minutes. So this one, it does have the same information in the dead wax as my first copy, but in this one it's all written out, whereas the other one, it's stamped in and then somebody literally scribbled it out and wrote in the reissue numbers. So apparently if you're just looking at these in a store and you can't test it, the only way you're going to know for sure is to look at the side B dead wax and make sure it's the original catalog numbers, doesn't have a reissue indicator anywhere. This one also mastered by Steve Hall and MCA. I don't think they've changed anything other than replacing the version of Heart of Glass. It seems to be the same for side 1 as the original copies. So that means you may think we're done with this record, but trust me, we're not. I've tried to figure out if there's, a general consensus for a favorite version, and it seems like, there's this primary one, the very few copies of the original edition of the album, again, seemingly primarily promos and white label promos only. And then some people really like the original British version. And then I believe also the Canadian version is a contender as well. But then there was another one mentioned that I was just like, that's kind of strange because usually I avoid those like the plague. So that's how I picked up my third version of this record. So this, of course, is the original picture disc edition. Normally, picture discs are something I totally avoid because they have increased surface noise, usually inferior sound quality to the original release or any other standard vinyl release, simply because of the nature of how the picture disc is designed. But people did say on some forums and stuff that this one sounds really nice and also has the original version of Heart of Glass on it. And, mastered by Steve Hall. So practically this should be another contender for a great sounding version and actually has the original track listing. You don't come across these too often. It is a bit on the pricey side, I think, probably also because you have this amazing still of Debbie Harry licking a 12-inch, and it just looks really diabolically awesome when it's spinning around on your turntable platter. Still has the black and white lines of the cover design, so again, the actual containing jacket for it is really cool. It's also double-sided, so it's not one of the picture discs where they cram the whole record onto one side. So you have a slightly modified version of the rear cover. So it's cool to have this to go along with the standard iconic jacket. But it does indeed have the original version of Heart of Glass, the 3-minute 54-second album version, mastered by Steve Hall. You do have a little bit of intrinsic noise simply because that's how picture discs are. But again, it is helped that this is a proper double-sided LP and not a single-sided picture disc. So I do think it sounds really great. I would love to one day find the original pressing with the original track listing, like maybe one of those white label promos or something. I can't say that it sounds 100% better than the standard one because the super clean version I have, the second pressing where it's actually advertising it, sounds great already. And I think I'm just obsessed with trying to find the original track listing because I've had so much trouble and gone through so many copies, and I still check bin copies I find, and I look at the dev wax. I'm like, is this an original? No. Is this an original? No. Damn it. Why do I still do this? I don't know. I have problems. But anyway, it's a nice piece. It has really amazing art on it, and it does have the original track listing. So if you really want that, or you're really a fan of this album, this is a really cool piece to find. But again, not super common and kind of on the pricier side. Of course, here you have side one with this amazingly awesome photo in its full glory. If you look at the dead box, it does seem to indicate that this is the original etchings that would have been on that very first pressing. So again, despite the increase in surface noise, it's not super noisy like picture discs usually are. So this is much more akin to a standard record because, of course, it is double-sided. Let me do this so you can see the band shot. So they actually use that for the second side. So again, even though it's got an increase in surface noise by a little bit, and it is noticeable enough, it does have the original track listing, which is very hard to come by on any vinyl release because, like I said, 99% of copies of this album will be the revised track listing. Next up is their Eat to the Beat record. I don't have the entire Blondie run. I'm still needing a few like plastic letters, but anytime I find a nice, affordable, clean copy where I'm able to fill in more of the gaps, it's super awesome. You don't see Blondie records all that often. Usually it's the same one or two or a beat up, parallel lines, of course, with the revised track listing. So I was very happy to finally find a copy of this. Really nice inner. This one, again, one of the, thicker cardstock ones with a nice glossy sheen to it. Again, really cool band shots here. And if an LP in this type of inner wasn't, super abused and played a whole lot, they usually are protected a bit more. But, if it slid around a lot, these will, definitely give a lot of paper sleeve scuffs to the LP surface. So if you have one of these, you definitely want to put it in a better inner, but these were usually pretty good at protecting the vinyl inside a little bit better than, of course, your standard generic paper sleeve. Another nice band shot. Get your credits information. This is again mastered by Steve Hall at MCA Studios and sounds freaking awesome. And on the standard Chrysalis label. Next up, of course, is 1980's Auto American. This was among the earlier records that I ever picked up when I really started collecting in college. You can usually find this at a decent price. It is more common, but still with everything nowadays, it usually has a nice premium built into the price. Still, really great solid album. Two of their biggest songs, Rapture and The Tide is High, are on here, and this is the way you want to hear them. Show you the rear. It's got a nice slight glossiness on the sleeve, which is always welcome and appreciated. Then for the inner, you get a nice sort of abstract piece on one side, and then the other side Just a standard cast and crew list, if you will. It doesn't credit who did the mastering, but for that I just had to look at the dead wax. So this one also is mastered at MCA by Steve Hall. Sounds just as good as the other records. So all Blondie first issues, second issues, anything from their primary heyday just sounds really great on wax, and totally recommended to pick up any of them. This was just a random, dollar bin or 2 for $3 or 3 for $5 bin pickup. This is the Columbia stereo release of the greatest hits of Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I think this is from sometime in the early to mid 70s. It sounds actually quite nice, of course, as most of this band's releases do. And, I've always wanted to find a nice copy of the first album, but this was just in super nice shape. The vinyl is actually pretty darn clean, so I was surprised it was in the dollar bin. And the jacket's in really great shape, and you get a nice vintage write-up. On the 70s Columbia label, the date for the record is 1972, but I'm not exactly sure when this pressing was made. Probably a little bit later. Also not sure who did the mastering, as is not indicated, but it does sound really, really nice. So it's, this I'm sure is a more common title, but the actual condition was so good, I was surprised it was in the dollar bin. So this was just a random blind buy because I had not, heard the Greatest Hits album in particular before. So just another one of those super cheap records that you just can't help but picking up. Next up is Bon Jovi's classic, iconic Slippery When Wet album, usually their most famous and biggest selling album, with most of their chart-topping, super well-known hit singles. Not really a giant fan of the band or anything, but this is one of those that it just does not pop up ever. I guess most people held on to theirs, and you don't see it all that often. Usually has a bit more of a premium price tag to it. So I always said if I found a copy of this, I would just go ahead and buy it. And finally one turned up at a decent price and sounds killer. So it's definitely worth your time. I do really like this US cover art far more than the original design, which got used, I believe, on Japanese copies and I think some other foreign territories. If you look up, I think it's in the Wikipedia article, but you can just look up alternate cover art for Slippery When Wet, and it's so terribly cheesy and dated and just really so terribly silly. So I think this is a much better cover choice. So this is Mercury and Polygram. No mastering credits on this or the inner sleeve, but it sounds freaking awesome. And even with some of these songs that you've heard 25 million times, like Living on a Prayer especially, this is one of those where you can just, especially with a pair of headphones, a really good like monitor can set, it really starts to sound fresh again. And I don't think there's a better sounding version of this particular album. I've not done like a full comparison between versions, but this just sounds so good it obliterates every other version I've ever come across. Here's your original inner with your lyric sheet. And then side 2 with a nice band shot, which I guess alludes to what the original cover design was, which, I guess it's okay, but it's just really stupid and cheesy, and just, I really don't like it. So I'm very glad they went with the change. But with this being yellow and having this shot in it, I think it was a very late in the game change. So I think it was almost used for the U.S. market. And you'll have to look it up, but it's just really, I don't think as good as what they eventually went with. So again, on the Mercury label, this one has a lot of stuff scribbled out. So I guess it was originally under a different catalog number. The stuff that's actually there that's been rewritten credits it as being mastered at Sterling Sound and being a DMM cut, which of course is short for Direct Metal Master, which was much more prevalent by the late 80s. It was a particular style of mastering records that you mastered directly from the metal stamper. Some people love it, some people hate it, most people are indifferent to it, but it is a particular cutting type that was only used at certain times. But yeah, it's not, none of that is stamped in there. It's all handwritten, and like I said, the original number information is all scribbled out, so it's like half the dead wax is just somebody scribbling out where somebody screwed up. But again, this thing sounds freaking incredible. If you find one of these, definitely pick it up, because I don't think this album sounds better anywhere else, but you don't see it all that often. So I think this is one that's stayed in most people's collections. So next up is Boston's self-titled debut album. Vinyl files, audiophiles, this album needs no introduction, but particularly this original first issue cut by Wally Troggett, just on the standard orange Epic label. This is one of the finest sounding vintage original pressings you can pick up. This thing is just sublime. Of course, the album and the band are very well known for their intricate, multi-layered recording style. This is a classic debut album, one of the all-time great debuts. And even though I'm not really super big into the band or anything, this is one I always wanted to find, the original Wally cut. And of course, he signed his Wally signature, mastered at Capitol. So that's how you designate these original copies. He would have signed it on both sides. But to make sure you have the very first edition, they always end in either A or the double A, so either A or AA. And that's how you designate in the matrix that you have a very first issue on both sides, plus the Wally signature. And what was great about this, the iconic cover is in pretty good shape, a little bit of edge wear and age wear, which is going to be typical for something like this. The cardstock's a little thicker, so it's stayed nice and sturdy. Get this nice band shot and write-up on the back. But as you can see here, this is actually a promotional copy, which for something like this, it's very tough to find a promo copy that would have gone to a radio station or a DJ and ostensibly should be a very early or very first cutting. So I was unbelievable. It was unbelievable that this turned up in the bins and just priced like any other generic copy. Sometimes you get lucky like that because most record stores, they're not really looking at promos or knowledgeable about that, or somebody's just sticking price stickers on because of course lots of stores have come across many copies of this turned in because they sold bukus of it back in the day. But it's very hard to find an excellent condition copy with the double Wally signature and the very first matrix information. So that's why this was such a great find. But again, the mastering on this is just sublime. It's one of the easy recommended top, 20 or 30 great sounding original pressings that really I don't think can be challenged. There are some versions that people really like, some like the Japanese, some like other ones, some like some of the audiophile reissues, but this thing just sounds so amazing to begin with. I don't really think you need to ever upgrade it. So again, finding one early matrix information, double Wally signature in the stamper dead wax, and in super great condition, particularly a promotional copy. That's just like unheard of. And here is the standard orange Epic label. This one, the cover's a little worn, but man, the actual label and the LP surfaces are just beautiful. This one ends in the 1AA, so it ends in the double A dead wax. Has the mastered at Capitol Wally in both sides, and he would also change up the way he signed, so it's not literally just Wally spelled out. This one, it's just WLY, which he would do sometimes, of course, just short for Wally. But again, one of the essential to own albums if you're into the format and you want the best sounding original releases of stuff. This is, like I said, one of the 10 or 20 best sounding original pressings out there. It's just phenomenal to find in this sort of condition. So now we move on to David Bowie, and my goal is to at least try and have his entire run of albums in the original British UK pressings on the RCA label, at least through the 80s era where the US pressings really kind of start to take over. Original US pressings, though, are really nice sounding. Some of them were eventually pressed on Dynaflex, which is the very thin and flimsy vinyl that RCA used here to combat the oil crisis of the early to mid-70s, which I'll get to that on the next record, but usually the UK pressings are the ones to go for. Of course, they're very valuable, they're definitely tough to find, and so getting any is a very tricky and very costly scenario here for Bowie fans in the US, but there's really nothing else that sounds like them, although original US pressings really hold their own, and some albums are, can be equal to the UK pressings. I've just not been able to experience, mint US and UK copies for each album so far, but just going off of my own experiences and what others have kind of said in forums and discussions I've had with people and other Bowie fans, I'm trying to go for original British pressings for the most part. With Ziggy Stardust, it's a little bit of a different thing because there you have to get into the different matrix information because there are different cuttings. There are some alternate versions. One of my all-time holy grails is finding the original UK Ziggy Stardust with the 6E and 4E matrix information because that is a particular cut with a slightly different version of Starman and is really the one I've always wanted to find. It's supposed to have a really nice, warm, very involving sound to it, which is slightly different to the original first issue, which has the 1E, 1E labels. But anyway, that's just a particular one. With Ziggy Stardust, it's a very convoluted matter. There's a lot more of variables there. So this was the first one I ever managed to find. I literally walked into a local store and it was sitting there in the used bins, and I was like, oh my God. And it was, $7. I could not believe it. So this is the 1970s reissue of Bowie's album, The Man Who Sold the World, which has become probably my all-time second favorite Bowie album, just behind Ziggy Stardust. It's extraordinarily heavy, and this issue has such a bass to it that it's one of the, I think, signature masterings on vinyl about, being all about bass and low end. And no other version I've ever heard of this record or any of these songs really has that same in-your-face, amazing quality to it with that, like, wall of bass to it that's right there in the lead-off track, Width of a Circle. As soon as that kicks in, you're just like, oh my God. It will define your system and let you know if your low end is good or not. So, of course, originally this was available in the iconic sleeve where Bowie lounges in a dress. That thing is so incredibly rare and valuable. It's one of, if not the holy grail of collecting David Bowie releases. So one of those will most likely set you back a couple $1,000s, and I don't have that kind of money. You don't have that kind of money, but for those who've ever managed to find one, it's amazing for you. But there's also a lot of bootlegs out there, so finding one and identifying one is actually a difficult thing to do. Of course, here in the U.S., we got the cover with a sort of artistic painting rendering of a cowboy in front of a mansion or house, and apparently that was one of Bowie's original concepts for the album cover, which would have had a different title, and they're now doing a reissue that has that cover again. So those of us who always wondered what that was all about, well, apparently that was an original idea. Personally, though, this is the reissue cover, also known as the kick cover, rather obviously. And, I've gotten more used to this because that's the version I've owned. And, outside of having the original dress cover, I prefer having this version over the cowboy version. I really like the starkness of having the black background, of course. This has seen a lot of wear and tear and abuse, so, it's not a perfect example of this cover. And one day I hope to find like a super minty upgrade, but, the vinyl inside is much better than the cover condition would indicate. It's just tough to find these, so I was just astonished. And again, it was years ago, much earlier in my vinyl collecting days. So, just walking in and seeing this sticking out. Nowadays, you'll pay $20 or more just for the original US copy or a US later 70s pressing of this, simply because Bowie records have skyrocketed in price and value since his unfortunate passing, which is just what happens with, anytime someone passes away, everybody decides to start looking at their back catalog again and buying all the stuff they didn't have and filling in collection gaps, and then the reissues start. With the Bowie reissues, it's a really nice campaign, and I would like to pick up some of the various things just for the B-sides and rarities and stuff, but for the actual albums, they did do some remixing and stuff, and it's not quite the same. They are really nice looking 180-gram vinyl remasters out there, but they are remasters. They're not the original albums, and for most of his output, you can't really beat the original pressings, I don't think. They sound incredible. There are some really favored CDs out there, like the very early RCA CDs, then the some people like the Ryko campaign from the late 80s, early 90s with a lot of B-sides and stuff. But anyway, this particular record, it's one of my favorite sounding albums of all time. I definitely think everybody needs a copy of this. Again, the bass and the low end on this is just sublime. It is unbelievable. You've not heard low end like this until you've heard this original UK copy. And of course, this is the 1972, I believe, reissue with the kick cover, which will save you, several $1,000s of an original dress cover. And from everything that my research and digging around seems to indicate, it seems like it may be the same stampers as the dress cover, which apparently they didn't make a whole lot of, which is, why it's so rare. This was not a super successful album, so this is one that sold a lot more once, Ziggy Stardust became super huge and everybody went back, and RCA was like, okay, we'll print more of that weird album nobody liked. Here's the rear, and because this is a UK copy, it has the typical British, very thin, very flimsy cardstock, which means it's very easy to get wear and tear. So that's why, it's just got wear all over it. But it's still quite sturdy. It's still held up well after all this time and years of abuse. And, ever since I've got it, I've had it in a sleeve and everything. But again, don't let stuff like this fool you on British copies, because again, the surface of the vinyl itself is usually quieter to begin with. So even with scuffs and stuff, these clean up beautifully. And this has been my copy for years, even though the cover does look pretty worn out. What's also cool is this one has the original inner, which a lot of copies are missing. So you get another rendering of the kick pose, but with a lyric sheet and really nice printing. Again, most copies are missing this. The only downside is this reissue came with a poster of this same image, which is a really nice fold-out poster, but this copy is missing it. A lot of copies are missing it, so you will pay a little bit more for a copy that is complete with original inner and the fold-out poster. And again, I hope to one day find a complete mint grade copy of this to upgrade to, just because I'm so in love with this pressing. And again, this is what made this my second favorite Bowie album ever. And here is the original British RCA orange label. So the other way to tell, if you're looking at copies on eBay, the UK Bowie albums will have the orange label, have RCA, and then have the white text on the bottom. A lot of sellers will mislabel things or try to fool you and sell you a US copy. You can usually tell the US copies because they will most likely be on Dynaflex in this era. So they'll have the same orange label, but on the bottom, instead of the white text, you'll see the black Dynaflex logo, which we'll get to on the next record. So you have to be careful when you're looking at the 70s era Bowie albums on the orange RCA label if you're trying to get UK copies, because it's very easy to mistakenly get a US copy or buy the wrong one on eBay if you're not paying attention to the actual label. And then once you go past that, you have to get into the matrix information. Again, this one has a 1E matrix on both sides, which seems to indicate that it's a first cutting for both sides. And I'm pretty sure they probably just reused the original plating for the that was used on the dress cover. So this is it's a pricey album to pick up because it's an original UK printing, but it's a real bargain over trying to get the original dress cover copy. And from all that's indicated, it should sound just as good. And again, has a really awesome cover in its own right. So this is one of those I think everybody should own. It's one of the great albums of all time, one of Bowie's masterpieces. Again, I absolutely adore this record, and this pressing is just to die for. So next we have Bowie's Pinups album, which is his covers record from '73, the iconic jacket with Twiggy in tow. And this one is a bit of a change-up because this is the original US copy, which features a different mastering that's quite a bit different from the UK version, from what I've been led to believe. So this one was in pretty nice shape, so I picked it up even though it is a US copy, because it's uncommon to find nice condition original Bowie titles for less than $10 for sure, but nowadays under $20 especially. Particularly good condition early copies of the 70s era albums, you just don't see, unless they're over $20 and or the condition is not super great. So the actual jacket's in nice shape. It's a nice, thick, sturdy jacket, RCA of course, with the Main Man logo. Original inner present. And here is the label, and as you can see, it's a little bit different because there's no text at the bottom, and it has the Dynaflex logo, which means this is an exceptionally thin piece of vinyl, and of course, very flimsy. So as you can see, you can kind of push on the label, and it just kind of bounces and kind of just flops around. A lot of people hate these. They got a very bad reputation, but I have to say, this thing sounds freaking phenomenal. It's really impressive for such a thin piece of vinyl to have such great sound. So I don't necessarily think that it's Dynaflex's fault for having inferior pressings, but it's just, the pressings weren't that good. Again, this was something RCA did to try and cut costs because of the oil crisis that was going on, but they only did it on the US copies. The UK original Bowie copies are on standard weight vinyl. So if you're getting original 70s era Bowie albums in the US, it's going to almost always be Dynaflex. And for this one, it apparently has a much hotter, much more in-your-face mastering, which probably is why I like it so much. Apparently the UK mastering is a bit more sedate, a bit different, so you really kind of have to have both. So I would like to get the UK copy to compare someday, but this thing is super clean and sounds really, really great, even though it is on the thinner Dynaflex vinyl. So this was a recent find. This was actually an eBay pickup. It was dirt cheap for what this is, so I couldn't believe it. I think probably because there's some sort of color error on the jacket. You have this sort of blue streak running through the cover shot of Young Americans, and I've been trying to work this sticker off, but when it's something like this, I try to be super careful. This is the original 1975 UK first pressing, and I'm thinking the reason why it was so cheap is because it's got this sort of color running through the cover image. But normally copies of this do not go for less than $20, which is what this was. The vinyl itself is absolutely mint. So I was really shocked to find this. I never thought I would get any more UK first issues for at least a little while longer, since the price of Bowie releases has just really jumped stratospheric in the past few years. So outside of that, the jacket's in phenomenal shape. Show you the rear. Just a standard jacket with the Main Man logo. And here is the RCA UK label. For Matrix nerds, this is side 1 is a 1E and side 2 is a 2E, so it's a 1E, 2E Matrix. This thing, it just is incredible. I don't have an original first issue US copy. I know some people debate and say that the US original is just as good as a UK. I would like to be able to compare them someday, but I do have the reissue US pressing, which I'll go over next. For Young Americans and Station to Station and some of the others, the US copies hold their own, and some people, prefer the US ones, but I don't have, both side by side. But this thing is just immaculate, sounds wonderful. And because this was recorded in the US, I'm sure the original US pressing sounds excellent as well. But man, I don't think this album can sound much better than this. This thing, I think the version to own, and I'm so glad I finally found a copy of it. And just keep your eyes peeled because these do pop up every once in a while. Ziggy Stardust is the hardest one to get because it's the most famous. The earlier albums like Hunky Dory, it's a little bit harder to get because, of course, there were less copies printed back in the day because Bowie was not as popular as he was later on. But it does seem you can get Young Americans in some of the later albums, even in their UK pressings, for a decent price if you keep your eyes peeled. So as mentioned, this is the U.S. reissue copy. This was actually one of the handful of records I inherited from my dad's collection that he decided to pass on, that I was able to cherry pick a few out. So this has the hype sticker for Fame and still in the shrink wrap. This does seem pretty much like what the original jacket would be like for the 1975 U.S. first pressing. So I'm not sure if they just reused them or reprinted them, but it's a really nice condition jacket. Same on the rear. This one does have the original inner, which I'm sure probably would have been what was the inner in the UK pressing. My copy just doesn't have anything but a generic sleeve. So it's pretty much just a lyric sheet for both sides. And because this is a later reissue, it has a slightly different catalog number and is on the black RCA Victor label. This is what most, if not all, of the later cuttings and reissues of Bowie's 70s albums will be on here in the U.S. So they're, usually not 100% as desirable as the original orange label first pressing US copies. But from my experience, it seems like the dead wax is practically the same. So it may just be a slightly later cutting, if not the same identical plating and everything. So usually you can get these copies. This one's super clean. They're almost always great. The ones I've had. Um, Usually they're cheaper than the original copies when it's people or stores who know that this is a later pressing. Sometimes they will have a little disclaimer on the front cover saying that they've changed the catalog number, which it does on Heroes. We'll get to that in a minute. So don't skip these if you find them, because it's still, the original album and everything, not like the remasters where they did do some changes and stuff. But of course, all Bowie releases have got more expensive, and you don't see them anymore in the stores. It used to be, even when I had just gotten into collecting, you could occasionally find these black label reissues, which are really nice finds to pick up because they're usually in really great shape, even if the cover isn't. So don't pass these up if you're just trying to fill a Bowie collection, because most of the time they will get you most of the way there to a US first pressing. Next up is the UK first pressing of Station to Station. This again, I walked into a store and it was just literally sitting there. And this was, of course, back in 2015. So even then, I was astonished to find it. This was after I'd gotten Man Who Sold the World, and actually it was the same store. It was just a year or two later. I was just like, whoa, what is this? And, ever since then, it's never happened again. But, it happened twice. Anyway, I've never been able to work these stickers off. This is a white cover, and it's very easy to get dust and dirt and stuff on. As you can see, it's got some discoloration. So I've tried to work these off, but eventually I just gave up because I didn't want to tear the cover or anything. I'm going to try again a little bit. Sometimes I've found if you use a hairdryer on very low, it helps to try and work off some pesky stickers. But if they're super pesky, I usually just try and leave them because I've been burned before trying to get stickers off. So that's why they're still on here. So yeah, this was a really surprise find. You don't come across copies of this album, particularly in the original UK version. The original US version is another one of those where some people swear it's as good as the UK. I would like to try one day if I could ever find one, but again, just sounds phenomenal. I've never heard this record sound better. They did do the really awesome, huge remaster box set a number of years ago with all the B-sides and demos and stuff. I was never able to get a copy of that before it went out of print. The cover image, of course, refers to the simultaneously produced film The Man Who Fell to Earth, which originally Bowie was going to do the soundtrack album of, but it just kind of metamorphosed into eventually what we got here on Station to Station. So here's the rear. Of course, this copy, the jacket's not in super perfect shape. It's got some tape on the edges and such, but you just don't come across these. And I think the tape is, of course, because this is a UK copy. It's got the very thin and flimsy cardboard cardstock. So, most of these, if they were not kept immaculate or pristine, it's going to have some edge wear for sure. Something that's just the nature of the design. But, the actual important information is still in really nice shape. There's not too much browning on the white, and of course you do have some inherent ring wear and stuff, but again, the vinyl itself is super clean. So this was just an amazing find, and one of those random times I walked into a record store and just sitting there right in front of my face is just something like this, and I'm like, oh my god. So this does not have a custom inner, it has a custom insert, not an actual inner sleeve for the record. So here you just get the credit information, and of course the mention of Man Who Fell to Earth. And here's the label. Again, for Matrix nerds, this is a 1E, 2E Matrix copy. Again, you can tell this is a British copy because of the way the RCA label is laid out and with the white text on the bottom. Again, some people swear by the US first pressing, which I would love to find someday, but you don't even see that all too often. I've seen the US copy once or twice, and both times it was overpriced and totally trash. So this copy does have some scratches and stuff, so if you just went visually, it looks like maybe a very good or very good plus, but it plays a lot better than some of the scratches would indicate. None of them are very deep or anything, but these UK pressings do usually shine through even some surface damage and stuff, simply because the actual pressing and surfaces were a lot cleaner to begin with. So This is a phenomenal listen. I think it's the way to listen to this album. And again, another reason why I'm trying to get original UK printings of all the major Bowie albums. Next up is the Black Label US reissue of Heroes, and like I said before, a lot of these reissues, you see here you have the new catalog number, and here you have very small text, the previously issued as the original US catalog number. So if you're just looking at the jackets, it's usually tucked in there somewhere, so that'll help you differentiate if this is the original US or the Black Label reprint. But again, there's nothing wrong with these Black Label reprints. They're really great sounding. It's the original mix and everything, and they should still be the original cutting unless something was changed. But of course, it'd be many printings down the road from the original first issue US copy. And of course, the first issue UK copy is probably going to be the most desirable one, but still haven't tracked down copies for every single album. Then that's a very expensive, time-consuming hobby. This is actually the only copy of Heroes I've ever seen in a store. I guess it's just one of those that just immediately gets bought, especially for the iconic cover. So again, I bought this very early in my collecting days. It was just in a shop at a super cheap price. This was long before the vinyl resurgence had really taken hold. So bought this for like $3, and the cover's still in nice shape. It's definitely worn. It's got some sticker wear. The bottom edge has a little bit of wear where the inner starts to poke through just a little bit in the bottom center. But, still perfectly presentable and still a really nice copy of the second of the Berlin trilogy. So here's the rear. So once again, don't pass up these Black Label RCA reissues if you stumble across a nice clean copy, because they sound really, really great. It's definitely a nice way to build a complete Bowie collection, even if it's not the true first issue. And here's the Black Label. Again, no mastering information, so I'm not sure who cut all of these. This just has the new catalog number in the dead wax, and that's it. There's no other information, but it sounds excellent. So I guess this is kind of like the European reissues that were on the green RCA label sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. A lot of people really like for certain albums, like Aladdin Sane in particular has a apparently really nice sounding release on that green label reissue. So I guess these are pretty much the US equivalent, these Black Label reissues. So definitely don't pass these up. This one, the vinyl is just practically immaculate, even though the cover is pretty beat up. So I'm very happy I picked this up years ago. And again, this is the only copy of Heroes I've ever seen in a record store just sitting there used. I've never seen another one. So I guess it just immediately gets bought up, and it's just not as common as, of course, the bigger albums would be. If you were to have one David Bowie album that was more common and you bought simply for sound quality alone, it would have to be Let's Dance. This is the original US pressing. Of course, this was a gigantic smash hit album, so it's going to be more common. But again, all Bowie releases have skyrocketed in price, so usually you'll have to pay a premium for this. What most people aren't aware of is that it's worth paying a premium for, because this thing sounds so incredibly phenomenal. It's across the board, brilliant production. So many brilliant names are involved in this. You've got Nile Rodgers, you've got Bob Clearmountain, and this was mastered by Bob Ludwig. And oh my God, this is one of the best sounding pieces of wax you can get anywhere. I can stack this up against anything. It's just an incredibly powerful, sublime sounding record. Everybody needs a copy of this, even if you're not huge on Bowie's 80s period. I mean, this thing is incredible. And again, most people are not aware of this, and they just, charge more because it's a famous Bowie album. So this one was a really nice copy. I waited to try and find a clean one that wasn't, $25 for no reason. This is on the EMI label because Bowie had changed over. So much more common. You shouldn't have to pay $20 for this record or more, but, it's going to be, usually marked that way because every Bowie release is more expensive now. So here's the rear. With the credits here on the back, and you see the magic words mastered by Bob Ludwig. But yeah, this is just a great combination across the board of great production, great recording, and great mastering. No other version of this album sounds like this, and I can't bear hearing some of the hit songs on any other release because they just don't sound anywhere near as good. So here's the original inner sleeve with the lyrics for every song spread across. Show you this way as well. And again, on the standard silver or grayish EMI label, Master Disc RL in the dead wax is what you want to look for. And oh my God, this thing sounds so good. This isn't my favorite Bowie record, but it's up there. There are other records that I think are 100% beautiful all the way through. This one's pretty close. There's one or two tracks I've never been super huge on, but you can't deny the popularity and importance of this being, a landmark in Bowie's career and reinvigorating him for the entire decade. But of course, kind of casting a long shadow to escape from, which took him a number of years to really sort of shake off the dust of Let's Dance. But my word, this is one of those LPs that everybody needs to own. If you have a turntable, you need this record. This pressing is that good. Just make sure you get a clean copy and you don't get too overcharged for it. But even having to pay $20 for this thing, it's worth it. You could put an audiophile sticker on this, or say it's a audiophile reissue, and it sounds that good, you could believe it. I mean, this is one of those original pressings that's that good. This is easily in my, best sounding 20 or 30 records I own. Just astonishing piece of wax. So unfortunately, that's the last studio album I have of Bowie's on vinyl. I really need to get some of the modern reissues of the last few albums. I've been meaning to do that for some time, but there's a lot of different printings of those. So on certain albums, it's kind of hard to figure out which one to go with, and some are easier to get than others. And of course, really need to pick up a copy of Black Star. So this is the last Bowie release I have going chronologically. This is the 12-inch extended version of the single Blue Jean from the Tonight album, which was also mastered by Bob Ludwig, so you can find a nice RL copy. And every time I find one, it's like 20 or $25 in most stores, which is just a bit ridiculous. So I'm trying to wait until maybe I can find a copy that's at least, under $15, which would be much more helpful. This one is in pretty nice shape and is actually a promo copy as well, which is the real reason I picked it up back in the day. This is another one of the first couple records I picked up. Again, just a nice 12-inch extended mix from the 80s, also EMI America. So here it is. This is the extended mix of Blue Jean. This was mastered by Howie Weinberg at Master Disc, and it sounds lovely. It's just at 33 1/3 speed, not 45. And then the flip side gives you two different extended mixes of Dancing with the Big Boys. So it's a nice 12-inch to have. I just wish, like with all 12 inches, I wish they would have included the original version of the single, just because I like having that on the 12-inch as well to compare and contrast. And then last, to end out the B shelf, this is Lindsey Buckingham's 1981 album Law and Order. Nice looking cover. I just picked this up on a whim, actually, because really I think because the big single from this album, Trouble, used to be in a lot of the video blocks on VH1 when I was growing up, so I heard it a lot. For some reason, it seemed to be in a lot of programming blocks and just get repeated a lot. And this was, way later on in the 90s, so it was long after this song was popular at all, so it just was one of those earworms that got stuck in my head. And so just whenever I thought of it, I was like, I need to get that record just because of that one song. So this is actually something I picked up. I was on a family vacation a number of years ago, and I remember picking this up in a small shop in New Orleans. So it's always cool when you pull something off the shelf and remember the instance or where you got it. It was just a bin copy, and like the 3 for $4. That's a little worn, but the really cool thing about this is actually a promotional copy. So it's got the nice, lovely promo sticker here that makes you feel special because you have a promotional copy. It's not licensed for sale, man. But anyway, you do get a nice gatefold. Sort of gives you that whole, again, feeling of on the road in transit with the shot here with the ashtray and matchbook and everything. And, of course, Kieran Bierce. I guess this was maybe when he was in Japan or something. Again, I really love it when there were inners or gatefolds or any sort of imagery with that sort of on the road or from the road behind the scenes feel, like shots on a tour bus or something. Gives you a real sense of where the artist or band was at the time period. Here's the original inner. This has the lyric sheet on one side and then the technical credits and dedications on the other. This was mastered at Precision Mastering with Larry Ermine and Stephen Marcuson, who would eventually become one of the premier engineers of the 80s and 90s and beyond, still working today, I believe. What's also cool about this release, not only is it a promo, this is a white label promo. So this is as early as you can get. And even though the cover is a bit worn, the actual vinyl, this is a near mint copy. So this was a near mint white label promo. So, and for like $2. So I was like, yes, I'm buying this. Plus it has that song that gets stuck in my head all the time. And in the Dead Wax, Precision did have a stamp they would use sometimes, or just written in their Precision. But when Stephen Marcuson would do stuff later on, he would usually sign it. So this one actually has Precision Lacquer SM written in it. So this is cut by Stephen Marcuson, who, like I said, became one of the premier engineers through the 80s and 90s and into the CD era and beyond. So this thing sounds really, really nice, and it's very uncommon that you find a clean white label promo copy of anything in a bargain bin. So it always pays to check cheap bins and actually pull the record out. Even if the cover's a little beat. I picked this up simply because it was a promo, but when I slipped the actual LP out and saw the white label, I was like, oh wow, okay, yes, I will take this. Well, that does it for this first installment of my record collection videos. Hopefully you found something interesting to pick up for your own collection, or learn some new interesting tidbits of information so that it can be floating around in your head the next time you go bin hunting. Thanks so much for watching, and definitely keep searching out new record finds and keep your turntable spinning.